Francisco, California, a momentous conference begins. Here, leaders of the United Nations, representing all but a fraction of the Earth's population, are laying the foundations of international security in the post-war world. United States Secretary of State Stettinius opens the first session and introduces President Truman, who speaks from Washington.
The Conference of the United Nations on International Organization is now convened. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The world has experienced a revival of an old faith in the everlasting moral force of justice. At no time in history has there been a more important conference or a more necessary meeting than this one in San Francisco. You members of this conference are to be the architects of a better world. In your hands rests our future. By your labors at this conference, we shall know if suffering humanity is to achieve a just and lasting peace. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace.
Just before the second day's session, the conference presents a pageant of nations banded together to make peace. Men of goodwill from around the world attend, including the distinguished Saudi Arabian delegation, and from South Africa, Prime Minister and Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts, a founder of the League of Nations. General Romulo of the Philippines, China's famed Foreign Minister TV Soong, and members of the Arabian entourage. Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. Soviet Foreign Commissar Molotov, British Ambassador to the United States Halifax, and Mr. Eden discuss conference details before the session in an atmosphere of cordial informality. They are joined by Secretary Stettinius and Russia's United States Ambassador Gromyko. These intimate pictures tell better than words the spirit of the San Francisco meeting, at which world leaders can talk over their mutual problems freely and frankly. Already seated is India's delegate, Sir A. Ramaswamy Mudalia. Jan Masaryk, Foreign Secretary of Czechoslovakia, and son of Czechoslovakia's late great founder, Thomas Masaryk. Ian van Kleffens heads the delegation of the Netherlands. John Sofianopoulos represents Greece. From Mexico comes Foreign Minister Ezequiel Padilla. Representing Lebanon is Charles Habib Malik. Mustafa Adil, chairman of Iran's delegation. Egypt's representative, Abdul Hamid Badawi Pasha. The delegates discuss the many problems of the historic meeting. Facilities for the press reporting of the momentous news of San Francisco are the most elaborate on record. From here, thousands of dispatches go round the world. Special telephone switchboards are run by trained operators speaking 20 languages. By radio and shortwave, the news goes out. Delegates of all nations lay emphasis on the urgency of their task, an undertaking which was outlined at Dumbarton Oaks and the Crimea Conference, says China's TV Soong.
To ensure the fulfillment of our aims for effective international organization, we must lose no time. We must not leave this conference without having arranged for the setting up of a new international organization.
Russia's Vyacheslav Molotov addresses the delegates. Mr. Molotov warns of the mistakes of the League of Nations and pledges firm Soviet cooperation for world security.
В работе настоящей конференции.
Britain's Anthony Eden speaks convincingly of the need for action now.
In the last 6 terrible years, unnumbered men have died to give humanity another chance. Unnumbered men have died because they felt there was a job of work to be done. We too have a job of work to do if we are not to fail these men. Let us do it with courage, modesty, and dispatch. Let us do it now.
Dead in the streets of Milan lies the body of Benito Mussolini, first of the dictators and the first to go, executed by Italian partisans, his own countrymen. Mussolini, the would-be Caesar, the founder of fascism, started with an armed gang and finally built it into an army, seizing power after a sham march on Rome in 1922. Also now reported dead, Adolf Hitler came to study and emulate the master Mussolini, busy with plans for Ethiopia, Spain, and Mediterranean empire.
In cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
By 1938, Hitler was fascist #1, and Mussolini only a satellite at Munich. By 1943, Mussolini, defeated in Italy, was rescued by Nazi paratroops. Wild-eyed, he ran to Hitler. Now the last pictures of Il Duce alive in 1944. He died badly, despised by his fellow countrymen. This was the end of Benito Mussolini. General Eisenhower, accompanied by Generals Bradley and Patton, their faces grim, inspects the concentration camp at Ohrdruf, Germany, captured by American troops. Everywhere are the emaciated dead. American troops forced the people of the town to view the ghastly results of Nazi brutality. Arnstadt, Germany, more victims of a brutality and methodical starvation too ghastly to put into words. Bodies are exhumed for autopsy and counting. Nordhausen, Germany, occupied by the First Army. The Red Cross flag now flies as United States medical troops bring what aid they can to the living dead. A few who still lived in Nordhausen lay helpless among the hundreds of completely dead when the troops entered. German civilians are marched into Nordhausen to dig graves for the dead. The German people who accepted the promises Nazism made must share responsibility for the deliberate brutality of the Nazi system. Ohrdruf, Arnstadt, Nordhausen, Buchenwald, Dachau. These and countless other crimes against humanity committed by Germany must not be forgotten as the world plans for peace.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Maher Nasser. I'm the Director of the Outreach Division in the UN Department of Global Communications, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event marking Charter Day. You have seen this film, and it is a reminder of the atrocities that have led to the creation of this organization. We saw nations coming together in San Francisco 74 years ago today to sign what we now know as the Charter of the United Nations. I don't know how many of you have one with you, but if you don't have a hard copy, this is a special copy that we produced for the 70th anniversary. How many of you has a phone? All of you. You can actually download a free copy of the Charter in any app store. So you don't need to go down to the bookshop. I'm doing bad business for our bookshop, but if you want a hard copy, you can go and buy one from the bookshop, but if not, you can download it on your app. Everybody can have access to the Charter, and everybody should read it. On June 26, just one comment on the film, actually. You have noticed that they were all men, and I think that's also part of the reality of the 20th century that we have to change. We need to make sure that future leaders and future conferences are attended equally by men and women. And this is why we tried to ensure that on our panel, it's not all men. So thank you, Atife. Thank you for being with us. And we should have done better with the balance, but it is what it is. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramu, for facilitating that. On June 26, 1945, the founding members of the United Nations organization signed the Charter of the United Nations, which had emerged after 10 remarkably swift weeks of discussion and negotiations. Today marks the 74th anniversary of signing that charter. I would like to now invite you to stand in body and spirit and to read together the affirmation of the opening lines of the charter, the preamble, which now you will see on the screen before you and I guess for us behind us. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which in our lifetime brought suffering,
and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. Dignity and worth of the human person, and the equal rights of men and women empowered and involved. To establish under justice and respect the obligations arising from treaties, other sources of international law, can be maintained to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom.
And to these ends, to practice tolerance and to live together in peace with one another, in good neighbors, to unite
international peace and prosperity. By acceptance of principles and institutions and methods, that armed force cannot be used in the common interest, and to employ the international machinery for promotion of economic social advancements of all people, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. Accordingly, our respective governments, through representatives of the city of San Francisco,
exhibited their full powers found to be in good and due form, have agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations, and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. Thank you for that. I guess the lines were running too fast. You couldn't keep up. But next time you come to an event for the Charter, you have to know it by heart.
There will be a quiz.
It is a tribute to the Charter that its purposes and principles, as well as its operative paragraphs, have endured a rapidly changing world. Indeed, in that process of rapid change, there have been advancements in human accomplishments, in communications and technology, in creativity and enterprise that were simply unthinkable in 1945, and yet which have helped further the sense of larger freedom and the dignity and worth of the human person that the Charter evokes. And there, too, have been developments that threatened to undermine those aspirations. It is the world unseen in 1945 that these lectures organized by the United Nations Academic Impact focus upon. in the hope that they will stimulate reflection and discussion within these chambers and beyond as the United Nations prepares to commemorate its 75th anniversary, and then, in another 25 years, its centenary. We are fortunate to have as our speakers at today's event, organized in cooperation with the Boston Global Forum, Dr. David Bray, who will share with us his reflections on artificial intelligence, the internet, and the future of data. Where will we be in 2045? Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Bray has served as Executive Director for the People-Centered Internet Coalition, focused on providing support and expertise for community-based projects that measurably improve people's lives using the internet. Dr. Bray, David, please.
Thank you. So as I come up, I'd actually like to invite Juan from the Boston Global Forum real quick. Since you have been so gracious to help organize this, and I want to thank everyone for having me here, can you real quick share a little bit about the mission of the Boston Global Forum before I go into my remarks?
Thank you so much for UN Academic Impact, our people here, and especially my dear friend Ramu Damodaran. Our event was inspired from his talk at Harvard last year at conference for G7 Summit Initiative, and we have initiative that AI Society initiative, and we think about how to bring AI good for AI and for society, for the world better. And we are very, very proud and very honored. Today is UN Charter Day. We, together with UN Academic Impact, to organize a lecture. Also, this is a very special event at Boston Global Forum, together with Academic Impact for that lecture, special lecture. We named that AI Society Distinguished Lecture, but today very honored day, so we named that a UN Academic Impact Charter Day lecture. Very honor for us, and also we hope David Bray will make you very impressive with his distinguished lecture for special day, and also we are very honored and very grateful to thank you, my dear friend Ramu Damodaran, and also our people here in panel discussion and people came here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tuan. So we're here to talk today about where will we be in 2045. As mentioned, that's 26 years from now, when hopefully the UN is celebrating its 100 years anniversary, and we're looking at a world that ideally is more inclusive, more equitable, and prosperous for us all. Now, first, I would say it's been said that there's two ways to predict the future. One is where you actually feed a whole lot of algorithms and data and try to analyze the trends to guess where that's going to go. The other way is to do either Ouija boards, horoscopes, or crystal ball. But in either way, you're probably going to be wrong. So I will first caveat and say these are my efforts to try and trace the contours of the choices that we have before us now that involve these technologies, but also, most importantly, involve people. Because at the end of the day, it is about all of us as people as to where we might be able to go and where we may want to try to avoid going in the next 26 years ahead. Now, as already mentioned, 1945, the UN Charter was signed. It's interesting to note, and I think, can we put up my slides, possibly? Oh, good. Excellent. Thank you. And I just want to make sure, so when the UN Charter was signed, it's worth recalling that Germany and the war in Europe had just ended 6 weeks earlier. That's how soon after those events that the UN Charter was signed, and it wouldn't be for another 7 weeks before war in the Pacific would end. So in some respects, the war was still going on when that occurred. And it's worth noting because that's a very pivotal moment. Now, here in the United States, The Nation, a publication, actually assessed that what the people of the world want is something that will not mirror their conflicts, but resolve them. Something that will despair their fears and will satisfy their hopes. I share that because I think that is very much true now in 2019 as well. We're increasingly seeing a world that seems to be becoming fragmented, becoming what some may refer to as being more tribal or more insular, as well as increasingly polarized. And I would say it's happening because we're not meeting those hopes as well as we could. And unfortunately, we're allowing fears to start filling the space. Now, on that second part, however, they said, this desire cannot be the nature of things fulfilled, which was interesting. They said that it actually requires nations to achieve integration and internal maturity before they can create a world organization that itself is mature. So this is worth thinking about because it's worth considering where we are now in 2019. Have we seen all nations mature? Have we seen maybe some slide backwards? Have we seen possibly failed nation states? And is that then a challenge for the United Nations to bring together a world? Because until we address those national issues, we may have challenges addressing those international issues. Something to consider as we put forward going forward. Now, on the technology side, events happened since 1945. Starting in 1969, there was all of 6 nodes on what was called the ARPANET in the American Southwest. Fast forward to 1982, the United States is beginning to get connected with connections of this ARPANET, as well as the Pacific and Atlantic connections. 1993, Europe and the United States are getting heavily connected, as is the rest of the world, but this is still pre-World Wide Web. How many people remember what used to be called Archie or Gopher protocols? I'm glad we have some people in the room. For those of you who never used this, imagine trying to access the internet through a text-based interface. That was Archie and Gopher protocols. This was pre-World Wide Web. This was pre-Netscape Navigator. Fast forward to 2007, they gave up actually trying to draw borders of countries to map the connections that made up the internet. And by the time you fast forward to 2014, they gave up even trying to draw the internet connections on a geographical map. So this is another thing that's also happening that has been challenging the world we're going into, which is, where's a packet of information on the internet? Is this where it's sent from, received by? We've recently seen with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, that is an effort to apply rules involving data privacy and technology outside your geographical borders. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but that raises huge questions about the sovereignty of the nation state, as well as where we're going as a world ahead. Now, 2019, we are here now. In some respects, great news story. For most of the world, child mortality is at a near low. We've seen an increase in prosperity, but there still have been things unmet, and with everything we solved, there are, of course, new challenges to be resolved. First, globalization has not benefited everyone. Unfortunately, when the economics and the policymakers were coming together, what they didn't say is globalization does not happen all at once in terms of rising all boats at once. Especially if you're in countries with strong currencies, your country's more rural and manufacturing populations will have to wait until the currencies of other nations are equally lifted up for globalization to have a benefit. We're seeing this in the United States. We're seeing this in Europe. I was a Marshall Fellow last year to Europe, had a conversation with a head of a major bank in England who said, if there's anything we can learn from Brexit, we didn't ask enough of the rural populations before we went to the vote. The same thing might be said about what's happening in the United States as well. The heartland is saying, wait, we haven't even benefited from the computer revolution. Why should we sign up for a revolution that involves artificial intelligence or automation? And so then we're starting to see a fear of the unknown, fear of the strangers, a nostalgia, whether it's real or false, for an era in which these things were not present because they have not seen all the benefits lift them up. This is not just a Western phenomenon. We can also be seeing this in other parts of the world as well. But I raise this because if there's anyone to start having the conversation about the fact that globalization has not benefited everyone, it should be the United Nations. Second, the good news about the internet, anyone can print whatever they want. The bad news about the internet, anyone can print whatever they want. This has created challenges because print subscriptions have declined dramatically. By some estimates, more than 80 to 90% than what they were 15 years ago. At the same time, digital subscriptions haven't picked up to take up that loss in revenue. And what happens when you have a loss in revenue in the media industry? It's all about trying to capture your attention. So the loss of subscription revenue is correlated to a return to sensationalism, and this is not new. We had this happen in the United States in the 1890s. You may have remembered a phrase, "remember the Maine." Unfortunately, that did not have good results as to where that went. But I raise that because we act as if this is some new phenomenon and we're not sure where it came from, when in fact, unfortunately, it is a consequence of we're no longer paying for subscriptions to our news, therefore it's become an advertising model, and thus it's become what can get you to pay attention and share your story with others. Any guesses as to the number one way to make something go viral on the internet? Any guesses? Make it angry. Second way to make something go viral on the internet, make it fearful. Now, you don't want to make everybody angry or fearful, because if you make everybody angry or fearful, it quickly dies out. Everybody agrees and they move on. What you really want to do is make it so that one group is angry and the other group is angry in response to that group, and it cross-pollinates back and forth. So we are seeing a product of where the technology is incentivizing the wrong behaviors, which is the delivery of news that makes you angry or fearful will result in more ad revenue, and thus don't be surprised if that's what's delivered to you. Again, something for the United Nations to address. It probably will have to be addressed individually by individual nations, but if we can begin to wrap our arms around this global problem, given the global internet, that may be something that can create a better future if we starting the discussions now as we head to 2045. Lastly, technology has super-empowered individuals. As already mentioned, almost all of us have a smartphone. Does anyone not have a smartphone and wants to say they don't have a smartphone? Just curious. According to some, you have more power than NASA actually had in terms of computational power when it went to the moon more than 50 years ago with that smartphone of yours. You think about it, it's the ability to actually not only communicate in real time anywhere in the world, you can do video, you have GPS, you have all these great capabilities. You can call a car, you can reserve a hotel, all through your pocket. But at the same time, these same technologies can be used for disruption as well. Unfortunately, there are examples. I come from the world of bioterrorism preparedness response. I did that for 5 years, starting in 2000. And it was interesting. I signed up in 2000 at the Centers for Disease Control's Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program in the United States. And about every 6 months, we said we didn't need to. We were told by different officials that we didn't need to exist. The Cold War was supposedly over. And it was scheduled for September 11th, 2001, weeks in advance, that I was going to give a briefing as to what we would do technology-wise if a bad day occurred. 8:34, the world changed. That briefing was canceled. We piled computers into cars, and we dealt with the response to 9/11. Didn't sleep for 3 weeks, stood down on October 1st. October 3rd, I ended up giving that briefing as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened, and unfortunately, 24 hours later, the first case of anthrax showed up in the United States. Technology, for good and for bad, is allowing people to do things that were only possible by nation states 40 or 50 years ago. That includes areas in what technology in cyber realm allows you to do, technology in the bio realm, which could easily be a conversation for another day. We have to face the reality that we are super empowering people to do both good and bad. And we have to recognize, how do you live in a world in which that's possible? According to both the UK Health Authority as well as the National Institutes for Health in the United States, between 1% to 2% of people in the world are psychopaths, meaning they do not have the same emotional response to hurting another human being that most of us would have. Now, fortunately, I would say the people present in this room are a non-random distribution, so I don't think we need to be too worried. But if that's the case, where we're 7.6 billion people on the planet, that does mean we're going to face a world of between 80 to 160 million people that will not have the same emotional response to hurting other human beings. You mentioned the atrocities that we saw in the 1940s and why the UN was created. Now, again, it's not to say that that's necessarily all bad. You don't want your surgeon to break down in emotional distress during their surgery with you. But it's recognizing that if we're super empowering people, we've got to recognize that not all humans have the same empathy towards their fellow human beings. And what can we do as a world together to possibly address that and possibly increase empathy around the world? So, we're seeing tensions. I'm first going to address open societies and then briefly closed societies, but we're seeing tensions emerge in open societies related to the ripple effects of technologies. And these ripple effects are creating disagreements over how we deal with corporations and firms, how we deal with trade, and how we deal with immigration. The first one is we're seeing tensions where some groups want global libertarianism. They basically do not want to have governments around the world play a heavy role. This is nonpartisan. This actually splits across different partisan divides, but there is an increasing movement that doesn't want people to have government regulation of the internet, does not want to have government regulation of monetary policy. Just a few days ago, Facebook announced, of course, its own currency. That's another example of this trend. Second, progressive localism. There are some that say, forget about the nation state. It's all about the local community, whether you do it at the city level or the community level. That nations really are just middlemen or middle individuals that add no value between the global activities and the local activities of my community. There's both good and bad with this. In some respects, working on the local level, you can be more aware of the needs of your people. But how do we deal with hard issues like climate change, where you cannot address that just locally? It requires all of us. There's national protectionism. Unfortunately, this is on the rise in Europe, in the United States, and other places around the world, where there's a desire to return back to building, whether you call them walls, fences, and invoke them both physically as well as economically, and result in tensions that say revert back to building higher walls and borders. This may be a response to the fourth trend, which was global neoliberalism, which has probably been the prevalent paradigm that most of the world has been following for the last 25 years. The belief that if you open up markets, you reduce barriers to trade, you have an inclusive, competitive world society, that would lift everybody up. But as already mentioned, unfortunately, globalization has not met those ideals yet. There are parts of the world, countries around the world, that are not feeling like free trade has benefited them. There are people seeing their way of life be eroded, partly through opening up of markets, but also partly because as technology advances with automation, with AI and robotics, those jobs no longer require 10,000 people to do the work. Instead, it only requires 50 people to do the same work. And then finally, national developmentalism. This is the idea that nations, instead of going in the direction of having an open attitude to trade and economics, should actually invest in their own people. But of course, that raises a big question, which is, if that's the case, how do we make sure nations think both about their own people, but also about the world as a whole? That we do not devolve into an us versus them. There have been some very classic experiments done in experimental economics where they take people that have worked together for 10 to 15 years, bring them into a room, and they randomly assign them beads based on color, blue versus red. They have them go into a different room for 20 minutes just to talk and socialize, blue on one side, red on the other. Then they come back and they say, we're going to give everybody in this room $20. You can keep the $20, you can bet a part of it, or you can bet it all. But whichever team bets the most will double their money. The other team gets nothing, and if there's a tie, nobody gets anything. What do you think happens? Here are groups that have worked together for 10 to 15 years. They convince themselves they're going to be more aggressive, more risk-taking than the other team, that the other team's going to wimp out, and of course they both bet it all, and nobody gets anything. We humans, as a result of our biology, for whatever reason, quickly identify affinity solely on the basis of bead color. That also happens with nations, that also happens with other ideologies. And we convince ourselves we must know more than the other side. This is a challenge we face because I would submit what we are facing as a world, as a United Nations, are the limits of human nature. And it took an event, unfortunately, like World War II, to bring us all together at that point in time. Of course, those in the room, we all know there are 30 human rights. The celebration of human rights happened 70 years ago, December of 1949, December 6th, actually. But ask the question, if we were trying to come together now as a world to agree on the same 30 human rights, do you think any of us would ever get it past our own national legislatures or executive branch?
Do you think we would even be able to have a conversation and reach agreement here in the United Nations? So we think that we somehow have progressed since 1945, but I would say what's happening is we've forgotten how bad things can get. That losing that memory of World War II and what happened there is causing us to have this idea that maybe we don't need these protections, maybe we don't need to come together and put aside our own self-interest, and we can go it alone. So, closed societies, there are also tensions. And I'm going to briefly highlight 3 of them as well. Closed societies are facing the need for taller walled gardens. As the world has, as a result, over the last 25 years, through globalization, become more connected, through the internet, and through increasing data transparency, this challenges closed societies, and their response is to build higher and taller walled gardens. There's also a tension to try and actually have increased stability controls, use of algorithms, use of biometrics, use of data to monitor everyone in their population and to assign them scores, to actually track them and rank them. And unfortunately, this is a source of control because, of course, whoever sets the metrics sets the rewards and sets the disincentives. And then finally, some of them have said, maybe we actually need a completely new world order. On one hand, as already mentioned, what was agreed upon in 1945 was not all-inclusive. We missed out on an entire half of the human population and should have addressed that by including women as well as men in the conversation. But on top of that, the people that were there, that still wasn't everybody. It was not as inclusive as a conversation it could be. But again, going back to the challenge, which is seeking a new order could be both good, but if only a few get to set it, it might be even worse. So I raise that because you are seeing those that are not happy with the post-World War II order, and unfortunately that does include the United Nations here as well, and are seeking to disrupt it through other means. So, what's happening on the technology side that are exacerbating these tensions? Well, 2013 was a year we made history and we probably didn't even notice it. There was about 7.1 human beings on the planet and about 7.1 billion network devices on the planet as well. Not all of them connected to the internet, and obviously not all equitably distributed across the world, but the same number of network devices as there were humans. Any guesses as to how many network devices were on the planet just 2 years later in 2015? 14 billion. We doubled in just 2 years the number of network devices. Fortunately, we're not doing that with human populations. That would be problematic. But I raise that because that's not linear change, that is exponential change. We're now anywhere between 30 and 35 billion, and it's only going to continue that curve up. In terms of data, there's about 4 billion terabytes of data. To give you in perspective, there's some that say that the text holdings, just the text holdings, not everything else, but the text holdings of the US Library of Congress is about 10 terabytes. So I'm talking about 400 million versions of the text holdings of our Library of Congress in the United States. Now, not all of that's data worth viewing. Some of it's a lot of cat videos online as well. But it raises interesting questions about how are we going to make sense of all that data. Fast forward to 2025, less than 6 years into the future. Anywhere between 75 billion on up, some of the more aggressive estimates say 100 billion, 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet, relative to 8 billion human beings. Now, in December of last year, we finally hit the tipping point where there were now more than half the people on the planet connected to the internet. Now, that does mean we still have an obligation to, at least for those who want it, to have internet access, because we still have another half to address. But if current trends continue, and we'll see whether or not they continue or if they change, we're going to bring on about another 3 billion people in the next 6 to 7 years. Think about it. It took us about 35 years to get 3.5 billion people connected. We're going to do that again in about 6 or 7 years. That's going to challenge notions of cybersecurity, notions of privacy, making sure people aren't exploited in terms of their data or other attacks. We're already seeing an increase in ransomware targeting hospitals, local municipalities. There are going to be ripple effects that are going to be affected. And in terms of the number of people, ideally, we'll move forward. In terms of data, the data is going to continue to grow so that we're now looking at 200 billion terabytes relative to 4 billion in 2013. How many people go past the third or fourth pages of the search results? If you don't, you're probably missing out on things that are useful. I'm glad some people do. But it does raise the question that search by keyword will probably no longer work. And actually, just like how we think it's quaint that some people still have phones that have cords, probably our children are going to say, wait, you actually went to the machine and typed in what you were looking for? Because what they're going to be used to, especially by 2045, is a machine that's aware of the task you're doing. And it says to you, I see you're trying to do this task. Would it be useful if I provided this information to you? And you say yes or no. And while that sounds great, that also means the machine knows what you're doing. It means that those that don't choose to share what they're doing with the machine and share their data with the machine may be at a disadvantage in terms of literacy versus those who choose, which raises questions about how do we avoid either surveillance state or how do we avoid surveillance capitalism. Just to give you another sense of the size of change that we are facing, Internet Protocol version 4. It's how we actually address several things over the last 20, 30 years on the internet. It's the 4 digits. We ran out of those numbers about 2 years ago. But there was about 4.3 billion addresses that we used, whether it was for web servers, FTP servers, anything on the internet. We ran out of those addresses 2 years ago, but that was the internet you knew. We're now moving to Internet Protocol version 6, which instead of having 2 to the 32 has 2 to the 128th in terms of the number of numbers and addresses. But what is the corresponding size object? If the internet you knew, if you put those 4.3 billion numbers in a beach ball, what is the corresponding size object for the internet you will know? Any guesses? I heard moon. What if I told you the size of our sun? This is unprecedented human change. Probably the only time we've had anything near this was when they actually started doing printed books. And so I actually was thinking about when I got over to say, imagine trying to actually be asked to give a keynote as to how books will impact society. It's sort of the same idea, which is it's going to have a whole lot of changes. And any guesses as to how long after books were started, the printing press was created, the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia, the notion of organizing by geographical borders, how long afterwards did that occur? It took 200 years. But I raise that because this will probably create new ways of organizing that may or may not be based on geography, may or may not be based on physical borders. And the question is that going to be better or is it going to be worse? Are we going to see a return to neo-feudalism? That may sound a little outrageous, but look at social media where you have the people with the 1 million followers. Those are the lords and ladies. You have the people with the 10,000 followers. Those are the vassals. And the rest of us are serfs. There's also been talk about universal basic income. That may also be a way that actually sort of is a return to communism of some form, if that occurs as well. New ways of organizing will probably present themselves, whether they be ideological, whether they be network-based, whether they be tied to corporations. And that may be part of the frustration we're facing right now, is it's no longer just about nations. Laws, technologies, and narratives all shape how we distribute power. The laws you pass, the narratives you use, and now increasing with AI and other technologies like the internet, like advanced data and analytics, challenge how we distribute power, and that's creating tensions as well. And I would submit that we are missing right now a positive narrative of the future. We used to do world fairs. We still have them to a degree, but they're no longer the attraction of a visceral, tangible experience that people can go to where they see themselves in the future, and even if it's wrong. I mean, I'm supposed to be in a space station by now, right? But it's about trying to give a hopeful narrative that is inclusive for everybody. And so maybe that's something the United Nations could do, is reinvigorate visceral, tangible experiences that are hopeful as we shape forward. Because in the absence of those narratives, don't be surprised if dystopian narratives fill the void. Now, again, going back to what was written in 1945, they said that this could not occur until nations themselves are mature. But I'm going to actually submit it's not about just having nations mature before you try to move forward as a global United Nations. It's also about making sure those global corporations are mature, as well as network communities. And what we may be seeing right now are there some corporations that are a little less than mature than we thought they were. And that's creating tensions and challenges around the world. So what are the choices we face going into 2045? First, Will technology continue to erode social cohesion? Going back to that ideal of libertarianism, I would submit at least fiat currencies require you to work together. If you remove fiat currencies, if you remove the saying that I need to actually use a common currency to interact with people, then you can imagine that you have different groups. You have an alt-left currency, you have an alt-right currency, and they no longer have to work together, and they've already had themselves create echo chambers in the news media. Now they start doing it on their currency basis, now they start doing it in terms of reputation basis. And lest this sound far-fetched, I already have had in the last year 2 conversations in Eastern Europe, won't name the countries, where there have been multiple times where there have been different partisan groups present that said, we're only having this conversation because you're here. When you leave, we will go back and we will not interact anymore. So we already have cases where technology has allowed different ideologies to become so extreme that they now see each other as adversaries or enemies, but they're attempting to coexist in the same physical space. And again, going back to the lessons of what happened in the 1940s, we know what happens when those tensions get too high, and it's not a good thing. Can we find a way in which humans can act locally and AI can help us think globally? I would submit for most of us, we can't think globally. Again, this is a non-random group of people in the room, but for most of human evolution, you ran into 80 people in your entire lifespan, and those were immediate family members for the most part. If you ask people to envision more than 150 faces in their mind, they probably can't do that. Cognitively, we are not designed to be aware of a world that is globally connected as the world we're faced. And that's, again, the limitation of human nature. But maybe if we find ways in which machine learning and AI can help us expand our perspectives. There have already been experiments where they have pen pals in different nations. The machine helps translate the language. You do this for about 9 months, 12 months, and then you reveal at the end of 9 to 12 months that that person who you've been a pen pal with, that you thought was speaking the same language as you, was actually someone of a different nationality, different background, and may have been someone that you would have normally perceived to be your adversary, but in fact, you've reached them and linked them together. We've got to use technology to overcome our own flaws as humans, and one of our flaws of humans is we cannot think globally well. Will a cognitive Cold War continue? I would submit right now there are multiple cognitive Cold Wars occurring around the world. It's not being covered too well. It's hard to actually attribute where this is occurring and who's doing it, but it's not something new. The reality is other nations have interfered with other nations in terms of information delivery and what they perceive to be truth for quite some time. But it's now even more possible with the reach that is possible through the internet and social media. And again, playing into the fact that we humans have limitations, unfortunately, we all have what's called confirmation bias. If something's delivered to you that sounds good, that matches your belief system, unfortunately, you will buy into it without a critical read of the actual article. And it's been shown that more facts will not change your position. Instead, they'll actually make you dig in more. Similarly, if you come out and want to say X is not true, we humans never remember the not part. We just remember the X part. We've seen this happen in the United States where a video of one of our rather famous congresspeople was posted that was obviously fake. But the question is, how do you address that in an open society? You take down the video, you've just done censorship. But you leave the video up, nobody remembers the disclaimer that says X is not true, they just remember X. So this is a huge question, which is our own human limitations as we become connected are playing into this cognitive war, this Cold War that is occurring. And it's only going to get worse as technology challenges our ability to actually perceive anything without being played into our biases. Will globalization's low tide, as already mentioned, if you're in a country with a strong currency, your manufacturing in rural areas are currently disadvantaged in a globalized world. Will that low tide continue to decimate rural areas? Just to give an example from the United States as a whole, 2 years ago, 47%, according to some sources, 47% of all the jobs created in the United States went to the top 10 cities only. 1 year later, 49.5% of all the jobs created in the United States went to the top 10 most populous cities only. So we're seeing this phenomenon, at least in terms of cities and job creation, it's a rich gets richer phenomenon. And the idea that somehow rural areas with a less of a challenge in terms of access, lower wage entry, it's not occurring. You see companies gravitating to where the workers already are, even if it's more expensive than going to rural areas. Which means something has to be done to replant that forest. It's almost like the Amazon, which is if you cut down Amazon trees, they don't automatically regrow back. You actually discover the Amazon itself is a desert if you cut down those trees. Whether it's done by governments, whether it's done by the private sector, whether it's done by academia or nonprofits, something has to be done to help these rural areas that are currently being decimated. Else we will have a challenge in terms of frustrated, upset people. And the answer is not everybody moves to the cities. At the same time these trends are happening in the United States, they're seeing mobility as a whole go down, especially in rural areas. People are being stuck in an area that is seeing their factories close, and they aren't able to move someplace else. These are huge challenges that we have to address. And then lastly, can you balance national interests with ecological and environmental interests? That, to me, is a huge challenge because right now, whether it's a corporation or a nation, it's almost a prisoner's dilemma, which is unless you can guarantee no one is going to defect in the bargaining, you are motivated to not cooperate yourself. And we have not figured out a way to use technology that can both encourage national thinking, can encourage individual private sector thinking, but also address economic and ecological interests. And this is the fundamental tension because we cannot, again, expect that everyone globally will somehow put aside their own self-interest. That's not human nature. It's even worse because if you're in societies right now that are not experiencing these environmental impacts, you walk outside and say, things seem pretty well. So maybe the technology can make more visible to others what's already happening, make it more aware and more proximate to us, because if we don't see it on a regular basis, we may not feel the compelling need to change our behaviors. So, what are actions we can take now beyond what I discussed? Well, first, we need to demonstrate how people can have greater decision rights over their data. I'm not talking ownership, because if you talk to any data scientist, the word ownership of data gets very murky very fast. It's not clear if you're curating it, if you're holding it for somebody, if you're creating it. But I am saying that we each need to have greater autonomy about what's done with our data, and the answer is not, here's a 30 or 40 page in-user agreement, do you accept or not? How many people read the 30 or 40 page terms and conditions? I'm glad some people do, but I would submit most of us don't. We need to push for a much more accessible and understandable way that everybody can have a better sense. And then try to figure out, do you have a right to some of the value that's produced using your data? At least in the United States, there are some estimates that say more than $30 billion of value is created off the exchange of healthcare data. Unfortunately, none of that goes to the individual patient that actually produced the data. So there's a market that is created, but it's not benefiting the individuals that are actually the sources of it, much less did they actually opt into doing it. Because there's a belief that if you chop off the personal identifiable information, it can be sold without their knowledge. But all of us that are in data science know if you get enough data, even if it's supposedly anonymized, you can actually de-identify where it came from. So do you have a right to the value created in your data? Do you have a right to correct your data? How do you know if certain corporations that have collected data on you is correct, or if they reach the right correlations? I was flattered, but I was once told by a social media site that apparently I identified most with the lost generation. And if that's the case, then I've been taking some really good beauty creams. But again, do you have the ability to actually correct that data if they reach spurious correlations? And then finally, do you have the right to opt in or out of using that data to inform algorithms and AI? Or is this done without your knowledge? And I raise that because it's not just about opting out, especially for minority populations. We've already seen cases in the United States and Europe and abroad where minorities, whether you be African American or others, the machine cannot identify your face because unfortunately algorithm data sets were not representative enough. But it gets even worse because if you're not providing your data, you may actually disappear as a history of your group. And I'm thinking of Native Americans in Canada, the First Tribes. These are groups that unfortunately are not having their history and their identity and their language incorporated in the training of what's being done on even just the basic right now machine learning. And if we're not careful, it could decimate and actually within a generation have forgotten that they existed. These are issues that we need to address in the United Nations. And it's not about shaming the companies doing it. The reality is they're charting a new brave world and they don't have a textbook. It's about addressing how we can make sure people are advocating for them, and it's them themselves ideally advocating, to be present at the table and to have a choice as to what they want to do and not be exploited. 2, can we demonstrate that AI can make public health and healthcare in general more affordable? Now, I picked healthcare and public health partly because I come from that background, having done bioterrorism, but it could be almost any field. But I raise that because this is something that affects us all and affects our lives. And I think that would help overcome some of the misperceptions about what AI is, because the AI is not the Terminator. It's not Skynet. But right now, most people's information as to what AI is, it's from popular press and Hollywood. And so we have to make it real to you and show that it can benefit your life in terms of either reducing the amount of time that you have to spend on something, reducing the cost of something, or providing a better quality of care. And can you do this for underserved populations, as well as including it for mental and elder care? I'm not just talking about physical care too. Then lastly, can we demonstrate how technology can positively reframe how we work as individuals and communities? I think if history is going to look back, it'll say we spent the last 30 years leading up to 2019 creating technology that was great for corporations and great for some people, but we completely missed the neighborhood and the community part. And we're surprised where now people feel more lonely than ever. We're surprised that people are more polarized than ever. And I'm not sure necessarily this can be addressed through market-based incentives, because if the market tries to deal with communities, they may only find a way to exploit them. We've got to figure out a group that can rally around how do we uplift communities and give communities a voice and a locus of choice and how the technology helps them. But again, going back to, we used to have at least some narratives of the future. They may have been biased in some ways, they may have been Anglo-centric, but at least there were some narratives about the future that were at least non-dystopian. I would ask, where are the non-dystopian narratives for 2045? And if we don't have non-dystopian narratives for 2045, don't be surprised if we create a bad future. So, having laid that all out and getting ready for the panel that hopefully will do a much better job of uplifting your spirits that 2045 is going to be great than I did, I do want to end with one positive note. This is a photo taken in 2013 when NASA's probe Cassini turned around as it passed Saturn. And it captured a picture of that pale blue dot, known as our home. Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, every human being you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. We're going to need more positive change agents for 2045. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I wish this room was also filled with ambassadors and representatives of member states. These discussions are incredibly important. You spoke about inequality and the rise of inequality and 47% of jobs having gone to, it reminded me of an article like a couple of weeks ago by Alan Kruger from Princeton University, where he spoke about since 1980, and he started about when ABBA's song, The Winner Takes It All, that came out in 1980, was a turning point in income inequality. He says that since 1980 until today, more than 100% of income and growth has gone to the top 10% in the United States, and 2/3 of that went to the top 1%, and the remaining 90% actually saw their income shrink. Your reference to attention and the fact that digital and how they try to get your attention is, again, Tim Wu's book, Attention Merchants, where he talks about the first newspaper in New York more than 100 years ago that tried to gain subscriptions by selling advertising, and therefore it needed to be sensationalist, and that's where we see today anything to grab your attention. Global libertarianism. Still, I think it is happening. Stephen Walt's recent article in the Foreign Relations, "You can't defeat nationalism, so stop trying," is a reminder that he had written a few years back that nationalism is the world's strongest power and probably most dangerous one. Yet, we see today that a recent poll published by the Better World campaign, which works part of the UN Foundation, that and it's a recent poll that a majority of Americans still support for the United Nations. Actually, it's the highest percentage in the last 10 years, 68% across party lines. Maybe more in one party than the other, but still 68% think that the support and presence of the United States in the United Nations is very important. So these are really important reminders that you have given us and just additions. And now I turn to our panel to reflect on what you have said. And I start with inviting my friend and colleague Fabrizio Hochschild, who is the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Advisor on the preparations for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, who has also worked very closely with the high-level panel on digital technology that the Secretary General appointed last year. The report came out actually 16 days ago on the 10th of June, I think, was the launch of the panel, and I hope that maybe at some point you can give us some reflections on the panel. Fabrizio. That one.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers. Excuse me. And thank you, David, for that very stimulating presentation. Thank you also, Maher. I'd like to come back to one of your analogies, just to underline a point you made, David, that we're really living in an era of unprecedented change. You drew the parallel to the invention of the printing press. But in fact, between the invention of the printing press and for the printing press actually to have an impact, or a direct impact at least, on half of mankind, took 500 years, because the printing press was invented in 1450 or thereabouts, and it was only 500 years later, in 1950, that humanity reached the threshold where about half of people could read. And until that point, it was an influential, of course, minority who really benefited from the printing press. So the process of being connected to the printed word took humanity 500 years through the printing press. In the case of the spread of internet, it took just 25 years between the first use and half of humanity being connected. So we're seeing change at an exponential rate. And this has prompted one person who's at the heart of this, the global chair of Nokia, to say that never again will we witness change being as slow as it is today. So now is the moment to try and address some of the challenges that David so eloquently briefed us on, because change is already moving faster than we're adapting, than our policies, our laws are adapting to, and it's only going to go faster. In terms of the sort of impact on this in generating insecurity and uncertainty, I think there are many other developments that compound it. New technology is a very important aspect, but we also have climate change that is moving us into a completely unknown territory. We have a resurgence of conflict, and we have conflict protracted again, something that has existed throughout most of human history, but after the founding of the United Nations, showed a marked downturn, but since over the past 10 years, it has shown an important rise again. And it's shown an important rise not least because of the resurgence of geopolitics and geopolitical rivalry, much of which is fueled by and taking on an aspect linked very much to new technology. The AI wars are the new fault line of the Cold War between China and the US. And then the rise of inequality, which David alluded to, but which is a global problem. I mean, the world has made very important steps forward in eradicating poverty, but in many countries, including the one hosting us, inequality has got worse. Inequality within certain countries has got worse, and inequality between countries has got worse. And I think one of the big questions I would add to the questions that David put is, what is new technology, AI, digital technology, going to do for inequality? Will it reduce it? Will it increase it? That was one of the most hotly debated topics by the high-level panel that Mahan mentioned, and there were very divided views. Of course, those on the panel who were entrepreneurs tended to take for granted that ultimately it would reduce inequality, it would create more jobs. But the hard-nosed economists on the panel said, to the extent we have data, and we don't have that much data, but to the extent we have data, it's actually, for the moment, creating more inequality than it's reducing. And of course, it's not just how it impacts on existing forms of inequality, but it in itself represents a new face of inequality. When you have the sort of empowerment that David mentioned that is given by the handheld device that everybody in this room has, you also have the disempowerment of those who don't have it. So there's a new divide between the haves and the have-not that has a digital face. And many make the point that it's going to take it may take much longer to get those online who are not online today than it took to get the first half of humanity online, just because there are all sorts of added factors excluding them that the first lot did not were not part of. So I think, altogether, we're living in a situation of great uncertainty. Sitting up here, the Secretary General in the launch of the high-level panel made the point that, his grandfather, who was in his 70s in the 1950s, probably had a rough idea how the Secretary General's life would look like when the Secretary General was 70, i.e., that's now. And the Secretary General made the point that he really had no idea what his grandchildren's life and world would look like 70 years from now when they're in their 70s. And I think that's true. I think for most of us, we're much closer to the generation of our fathers, of our grandfathers, and possibly even our great-grandfathers than we are to knowing what the world will look like for our kids or our grandkids. So we are at some sort of tipping point with a lot of uncertainty. And of course, we tend to populate what we don't know with the darkness, with monsters. So, the views are often rather dystopian and full of fear. But of course, there will be many positive things too. I think that the main lesson we draw from this is that we really need to even if we can't know the future, we need to get a better grip on some of the current trends. And I think some of the key questions David put out there around data management, around impact on local versus global, are questions for us now. And we need a global steer. I think, what has happened when we faced other new technologies, and I'm thinking of nuclear or outer space exploration, national governments and international organizations stepped in very quickly to try and ensure that those policies were steered for the good, that unintended consequences were contained and that malicious uses were, as far as possible, stopped. And that happened with the splitting of the atom very quickly. It happened with outer space very quickly. In both cases, the UN played a key role. I think because of the pace, and because these new technologies are really, governments are in catch-up mode. Previous new technologies, the governments have had a heavy hand in their development. In this case, it's almost exclusively done by private enterprise, and governments, even the most advanced, are desperately trying to catch up. But the difficulty of it should not steer us away from the need to urgently get a better steer on this if we are to manage the consequences, to really maximize the benefits, and new technology brings many benefits, but also curtail the unintended consequences that are getting more and more apparent. Some of the digital platforms did not know when they proudly entered Myanmar that doing so would greatly increase inter-ethnic violence and inter-ethnic deaths, and too late started drawing lessons on how to avoid that. So dealing with those unintended consequences and containing malicious use. And I think that was also the impetus behind the Secretary General's high-level panel. I mean, much has to be done at the domestic level, and many countries are doing a lot. Much has to be done at the regional level, and Europe in particular has done a great deal. But given the nature of these technologies, which by their definition are cross borders with ease, that's why the borders disappear on the maps David showed. Borders don't really, are not recognized by these technologies. And certain countries can, with huge costs, try and introduce sort of digital firewalls, but that's not an option for most countries. So we need international cooperation to steer this technology for good, to contain the bad. And that was the impetus behind the high-level panel report that Maha mentioned. And there are a number of suggestions about how to do that in the digital age. What worked in the nuclear age is not adapted to the digital age. We can't spend 15 years negotiating an international convention, because by the time it's concluded, it will be out of date. So we also need we can't have mechanisms that are exclusively state-led. Companies have to be brought in. Civil society has to be brought in. So we also need new forms of governance for the digital age that are faster, more nimble, more inclusive. And there are a number of suggestions in the high-level panel about how to go about that. So I think we need to think much more about these challenges with regard to new technologies, but also more broadly with regard to climate change, with regard to growing inequality, with regard to population evolutions, demographic evolutions, and with regard to migration, and trying to reflect more on that so that we can make our international institutions serve better the delivering on the future that everybody aspires to, that is enshrined in the SDGs. The Secretary General wants to really have a debate around those questions next year, that he's asked me to lead, together with the Department of Global Communications and that the Maha represents. So we will be trying to have that debate next year, and we very much hope that you'll all participate in that. And I think today is a sort of unintentional kickoff, because we started with looking forward to 2045, which is very much the way the Secretary General wants to frame the debate for global dialogues all over the world next year around these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And I think maybe just one thing I wanted it recalled as I heard both of you is we do live in a changing world, and the world will continue to change, and maybe, as you said, at a faster pace. I would like to just reminded of something Boutros Ghali, Secretary General in the early 90s, said in one of his first speeches to the Security Council. I can't remember exactly the full quote, but it's along the lines of, we live in difficult and changing times, and only one power remains that can impose order on incipient chaos, and that is the power of principle transcending changing perceptions of expediency. And I think that is what is probably constant. The principles cannot change, no matter what and where we go. If you stick to the principles, and I think what are the principles that we stick of? These are the principles of the Charter and the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So with that, maybe thank you, Fabrizio. I'd like now to invite Dr. Mariko Gakea of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your introduction. And first of all, and then most of all, I'd like to congratulate Ranu and then Denise and then other executives at the UN and people who are convening here today. You had many other options to be in somewhere in New York in the beautiful weather, and the sunshine was just, giving us so much energy and brightness. But you have chosen today to convene and then be here, this very important day of Charter Day. And I'd like to also salute Tuan, your leadership to bring Ramu together to organize this very important forum. And Boston Global Forum has been amazingly innovative to bring the notion of how we can construct AI global ethical standard. That is something that I hope you can all convene to see the development and be part of this very important initiative. Thank you, David, for giving us great scope of comprehensive analogy and information. I can really salute another David here, my colleague. When we teach, we actually learn from, learners. We won't say student because, we are equal in a way to develop the knowledge and build the future. So today, entire, the conversation can be framed as a little bit in my part to look at what is, academic impact that has been brought into the conversation, because that's the echo that Ramu has been working very effectively, and then we really salute your leadership. And what is academic impact? When 1945, after only 6 weeks, all this atrocity, and then you saw the video, many people died. I'm Japanese. I'm very grateful that my life, I didn't need to go through, experience, or witness any wars or conflict. But my grandparents' generation, my family, entire half of the family are gone. So we leave the legacy, history of human evolution or life. And you come here today, and being academic, I can't just simply underestimate the power of knowledge, who owns the value of knowledge, who craft the knowledge to give enticing power to make a decision and a judgment to the society. You heard the David explain about evolution of internet, and an entire human life we witnessed amazing rate of evolution of all aspects of economic development to societal mobility to education to other aspects. But when the first idea of AI was introduced, it was 1956. As an amazing way to reconstruct our world, nation, noted as a scientific discovery. But now, when you look at all the literature or all information in the newspaper, it's contested as economic, social debate or subject. So you see that how long it took us to come to this stage. That how are we really framing AI's role and the future perspective into our life? My core disciplinary area is in social policy and then also in OB area, organizational behaviors, learning sciences. I'm basically very interested in how we can help individuals to thrive in this very complex world that we live in. So every day I get up and talk to my learner, the student, my colleague, and my family to think about how their emotional stages are and what they aspire to live. What is the worst living? What is worth teaching? So, in the narrative that David has described, he has given very important, yes, there are more pessimistic or a little bit, the negative side perhaps that we may encounter. But other coin is there is a very, prosperous and then the positive development. If we all come together to build it and be part of entire development. So, there are many areas. I wish this lecture can go on with David for 1 or 2 more days, because we usually have 2 to 3 days. And last week, kickoff at Harvard, which I was proud of, and I'm still proud of, 10,000 young students who are in high school to pre-college mainly, and then in the college kids. They entered the summer school in Boston at Harvard with lots of, wisdom and then expectation and an aspiration for their life to build and make sure that they wanted to be part of this change. So, entire my framing and then also the construction of my comment is really built on positive psychology and then my background of the learning sciences and then the social, the cohesion and then that area of contribution that I hope we can build to further develop academic impact and then the compact into building the future action that SDG needs to really, apply and then succeed in our humanity to thrive. Just being, as a teacher and then also a convener for many other, lectures and meetings, it's very critical that, in academia at the moment, and then what is the role of higher education? Because you heard what David mentioned about there is a very complex and very complicated information and then the knowledge that you have to go through to get that. But where's the platform now? When you look at the history in the early 20th century, we are talking about 1915-ish. In the US, let me give you just a brief map of what was like your grandparents or your parents' generation. Only 20% of people are enrolled in the high school. High school. Most of the people are up to middle school. That was the fact. And then it took only 30 years to get the massive public education at the high school level. We reached that level after 30 years. So we are talking about, the 80s. Do you know that statistic? 70 to 80% of people entered. So, that's just a very brief snapshot about how education, the first generation of innovation that happened to educate this population, and then brought economic prosperity into the massive, supply chain and the manufacture and the different, industrial revolution. And then, my generation and, around that generation was very fortunate to get the benefit of a higher education. World get very, much faster rate of progress, and then the work itself, the skills and then the competency and the knowledge has also advanced. So in the domain of knowledge and then the cognitive, cerebral, development, we needed to have a different platform of learning. But we were able to really learn. And, now, a younger generation have an amazing tools, technology, really transformed your knowledge that you can, learn not only going to school, but you can learn anywhere with the, apps and then other stuff. I remember when I was doing my PhD, a few decades ago, we are going through all the catalog to really only choose one book. Took us like several days to find the accurate book. But you have a very different, the tools that, at your disposal. So, when I think about this knowledge development and knowledge creation, disbursement, it's so critical that, we really need to make sure that every action, especially those who are in computer science or who are doing algorithm development, perhaps in California or in the Boston area, and I have some students who have been really into the dive for, algorithm development and analytics and so on. But we need to bring a different type of people who develop and design, which are really human-centered, meaning that, all these apps are mainly developed by, really typical, white and young, really focused population. But this, aggregation of data, it will really lead our life. But David said that there is a really, skewed population that maybe will be mainstream if we don't include, different population, minorities, a disadvantaged group of people. How does this mainstream of data will look like? We will continue to really manifest the platform that won't serve for the real needs of people. If we don't take care of each other, we live in the one planet. When you think about the health issues, I also work in the health issues, it's very critical. If we don't take care of each other, different pandemic, different disease, it may happen. We mobilize, we really are mobile, 21st century. We move around, and in a week we go to Geneva, we go to the Paris, all over the world. So we are connecting, we breathe same air. So if we don't take care of sanity and then the basic needs of our human, beings, all this unconscious, but it's very conscious level of, disaster can happen. So it is very critical for us that the knowledge should be really distributed, and the knowledge needs to be really reach out to every population. This is a land. Please remember, I just happened to be at San Francisco War Memorial Performing Arts Center only a few months ago in San Francisco, where this charter was signed. I still have a photo. It's just maybe the fate. And we had International Competitive Education Forum as anniversary to commemorate this charter. So education sector is really having cognizant about how UN and SDG needs to really collaborate with the education sector and public education. So it's very, it comes with my heart that the land that we sit in New York here, and the people who came to convene to build this institution as the icon for the freedom. This was the land of freedom. And now we have to take this place after 75 years as home of strong courage and in unity, that everybody, working in different, area, but we should come together. So knowledge is not for a private profit. Knowledge is for the public goods. Please, we have all the intergenerational wonderful, wisdom. We can really build this world together to have a better prospect. But the knowledge we need to really protect and make sure that we will really reside at the UN level to really serve for the public good, for the humanity to thrive and then to have a peace. So I really thank you for the work that you do. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and then really look forward to forging for the action that will really sustain our global, peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariko. You spoke about what is living, and I saw an episode of a new series yesterday, and in it there was reference to transhuman, where humans download their knowledge on a digital, and I thought it was still science fiction, but there was an item on BBC today, and the news talks about transhumans. So we're not that far from the future that we see in science fiction these days. And education, no longer, you spoke also about education. Education is no longer literacy, and literacy is no longer just reading and writing. I think we need a new principles for digital literacy. How do we distinguish what is right, what is fake, and what is true? And I think in the world where sensationalism and hate, as you said, and anger are the most easy to spread, the United Nations Secretary General actually from also this room launched last week a United Nations action plan to combat hate speech. And I think this is something that the United Nations is aware of, and I think we want to be on the front lines for fighting hate speech. So now I would like to invite Dr. David Silverzweig, Chairman of the Psychiatry at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where he also co-directs the Center for the Neurosciences. Please. You need to press the button. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much, and thank you, David, for a broad and deep discussion, and Fabricio and also Mariko for your comments. I'd like to build upon those comments from the vantage point that I have as a physician, as a psychiatrist, neurologist, neuroscientist, educator. I will first say that to be here today to celebrate and to participate in the UN is really very special, and I think that the with the film that we saw, if my family had stayed in Europe, I wouldn't exist probably. So I think, as we try to transcend the atrocities that we saw on the film, it's exceedingly important that we, for everybody in every group throughout the world, particularly disadvantaged or disenfranchised groups, that we learn the lessons of history. And perhaps with AI and the internet, we can achieve something that humanity hasn't been able to achieve, which is sort of transgenerational learning. This was sort of alluded to, and the fact that each generation seems to have to go through wars when they forget the horror. Maybe we can do something about that with organizations like the UN, with the digital revolution that we've been talking about, and with this confluence of the UN and academia. So I want to salute Ranu and thank you, and also Tuan for the Boston Global Forum and AI World Society that I'm part of. I think that we are in an era right now where we're on the defensive in terms of the UN or academia. And we have to help people understand that the dangers and threats or the stoking of fears that was described that people engage in around global organizations or around academia and so-called the elites and so forth, that in fact we have to participate. A mentor of mine, Jack Barkis, used to say when we were dealing with particularly difficult issues or particularly difficult people, he would just turn to me and say, "David, we're an imperfect species." And that sort of summed it up rather well. And John Kemeny, who was the president of Dartmouth when I graduated, made a speech about how important it was that people had technical and scientific literacy, that in order to be citizens, not just for vocational purposes or educational purposes, that the world was going to change. And he was certainly right, as one of the inventors of BASIC, one of the first computer languages, in a way that you have to be educated in and sophisticated in to understand. Otherwise, you're more likely to be manipulated. Otherwise, you're more likely to to have your own free will hijacked, which is a really interesting phenomenon in terms of the brain mind. The most nefarious sort of manipulation, obviously, is when people or corporations make you want to do something that they want you to do. And you think that it's your own, or you come to believe or feel that it's your own volition. How does that work in the brain? How does the brain get hijacked, and how do we protect it? Indeed, how does the brain sort of handle all of this? Because artificial intelligence, in fact, is based upon human intelligence in the first instance, and our brains evolved in a way that over millions of years is both a model for AI as well as is being manipulated by AI right now. As you go deep in the brain to areas that are phylogenetically older, evolutionarily, the processing is more automatic. It's unconscious, not in the old psychoanalytic sense of unconscious, but unconscious in the sense of automatic processing that's not amenable to conscious awareness. It's more involuntary and reflexic, more stereotyped, those responses. Whereas as you go to newer, more evolved parts of the neocortex in the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, which has evolved tremendously in our species, you get to more conscious, voluntary, flexible thinking. And one way of sort of construing some of the lessons of today is that we have to enhance frontal lobe functions. We need AI because there's this balance between the sort of top-down, executive, rational, empathic control that our brain is capable of, and the sort of bottom-up, phylogenetically older, reflexic, defensive, aggressive sort of processing. And so the way I look at it, we sort of need to tip the balance. And as Maher alluded to, these days, in fact, we're getting to the brain-computer interface. And the work that we and colleagues do entails trying to decode neural network computations, if you will, or processing, then feed it to AI, crunch those numbers, and in a way that is real-time, can feed back into the human brain signals that can help modulate in a therapeutic way to overcome paralysis or to overcome crushing depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or things like this. If you think about the moral machinery that we have in our brain and the need to enhance the pro-social as opposed to the antisocial processing and behavior and decision-making that we have as human beings, this is where we have either the danger of AI or the hope of AI, probably both, and so that we have to work in a transdisciplinary fashion to be able to transcend this sort of in-group, out-group distinction that was talked about. We evolved in groups of 40-plus people, extended family, and your brain, it was an adaptive advantage if you cooperated with the in-group and if you were suspicious of the group on the other side of the mountain, who could come and take your resources, kill you, and so forth. And the problem is that society and culture have evolved a lot. Technology has certainly evolved a lot, but we're still stuck with the same apparatus. So how do we combine all of this? Well, we can take advantage of what we're learning in academia and take advantage of social neuroscience. Neuroscience mostly was sensory motor, the study of moving or seeing. And then in the 1980s, it became possible to understand cognition, memory, language. In the 1990s, it became respectable to understand the neurobiology of emotion. And then in the 2000s, the neurobiology of social processing. How is it that we as an organism or an individual can represent in our brain minds the fact that another organism has a brain mind and has their intentions, let alone their rights and possibilities and dreams and hopes and fears? How is it that we make moral decisions? How is it that that when it's your in-group, your moral threshold is one level, but if it's the out-group, all of a sudden people are willing to do things that otherwise they would never even conceive of, often in the name of ideologies or religions or nationalism, etc. And so, in a way, what we really need to do is make the whole world the in-group. And of course, that's what the United Nations is designed to do. We need to be able to not tolerate intranational disasters and authoritarianism, and get to the point where we can bring enough people along and empower these organizations together with the other existing forms of governance to be able to get beyond sort of smaller notions of identity where fears can be stoked, and get towards a broader humanistic set of values and principles and governance with consequences that will allow us to make sure that AI, as it grows in its capabilities and as it develops hidden layers that we are not even able to understand the nature of in terms of what algorithm is transpiring, that we remember that as human beings that we need to control that it has to be for the common good. Hence the AI, the Boston Global Forum work on trying to develop an ethics of AI and a set of principles and buy-in. Finally, I'd just like to say that, you know, as David mentioned, and he touched upon so many really critical themes, there's always going to be that small percentage of the population that are bad actors. As a physician, I will say that surgeons are not antisocial. They may have more steely emotions, but their moral emotions are very high. But the people who are sociopathic and psychopathic, who literally don't respond the way most people do to the suffering of another human being, and or the people who, for reasons of greed and power and so forth, will act in bad faith. I think that's really critical as well, because we can have organizations and laws and governance, but what do we do about the state or non-state actors who are not obeying the rules, who are being aggressive? How do we address that in terms of the overall human population? I think unless we figure out some way to either deter or address that, then, you know, most of the people most of the time will be good. But as we heard, increasingly, individuals and small groups, let alone states, have terrible power. So I don't want to end on a dystopian note, and so I will, you know, come back to health and public health, and to the notion that that mental health is health, and the brain is the organ of the mind, and the way we treat each other is the beginning and the end of it, and the way in which we as a species decide to use and develop AI and to deploy it and to govern it will be critical for our future. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, David. And I think you reminded us about the importance of studying the brain and how we function, at least for now, the brain we know, before they implant with technology and AI. And I think for people working in communications, we are aware of studies that show that basically the only thing that's common amongst us, no matter where we grow in our culture, is storytelling. We all enjoy a good story. We all like to learn from stories. As children, even as adults today, we see a film that is a story. And stories give us pleasure. And I think research has shown that a good story can actually trigger the same pleasure in your mind as anything that pleases you. The same way pleasure does, the ability to excite the neurons that make dopamine and stimulate the creation of oxytocin, which is the chemical that promotes pro-social empathetic behavior. I think for us, as communicating on behalf of the United Nations, I think we need to use these tools more by telling stories that people get, and then they change their beliefs and the way they, more than data. I think we can show all the graphs to somebody who's a climate skeptic, they will not believe it. The minute they see something, extreme weather conditions that is impacting them and affecting somebody they love and affect, that might change their mind. So thank you. So now I turn to a friend and colleague, Atif Riazi, the United Nations Assistant Secretary General and Chief Information Technology Officer for the United Nations. Atif.
Thank you very much, Maher. First of all, I have to welcome all of you to this wonderful room and to the UN. It's always great to have academia here. We need to reach out a lot more often to our partners, to the private sector, to academia as we look at these complex issues. And I'm really privileged to be sharing this panel with my distinguished colleagues. Thank you for being here. And it was wonderful listening to you, David. It was, I mean, you challenged us and you posed so many questions to us, which as I was sitting here thinking as the CIO of the UN, as you posed them, I was thinking, what am I going to do about that? And how am I going to solve that? So I'm filled with questions at this point, and I'd like to pose some more questions because I know you guys have the answer to those. But I want to reflect on something you said, which just caught my attention, about 14 billion devices. 14 billion. You know, we've moved from being a Homo sapien to Homo mobilis to connected sapiens, and we're not this species we were before. And it was mentioned one of my panelists about, you know, very soon we will be a combination of silicon and carbon, not only a carbon creature. And we don't really know what that species would think about and react and act. And I think this is a turning point for us to think about that. But 14 billion devices also says something else to me. It says 14 billion contact points at risk, because when we think about cybercrime, cyber risk, identity theft, wow, how do governments manage that? And why do governments have to manage that? Why is it that the responsibility of all this stuff has to fall on governments, UN, NGOs, when the private sector is benefiting tremendously from all of this? And I want to come back to that because that's a big question. Maher said we wish we had the member states in this room. Yes, we need member states in this room, but we need the private sector in this room because this has just gone too far. And as a CIO, I see the advancements of technology. We benefit tremendously from it, not as much as the private sector, but we also have to deal with the consequences. As Fabrizio said about this kind of impact, the negative impact of technology, we have to deal with that on a day-to-day basis, internally and with our member states. So 14 billion devices says, what is our program around e-waste? Because it's easy to sell the devices and it's easy to buy them, but the impact of mercury, lead, I mean, this impact on water, on land, it's tremendous, and it's tremendous in the developing markets, and it's tremendous on women. It's the biggest impact is on women because, you know, as women are dismantling these devices with their bare hands, and mercury is something that your body mistakes for calcium, and as you get pregnant, you deliver, it would go right into your child. So So do we think about how do we get together in a room and talk about the impact of innovation? Because we benefit from it, but we never think about impact. And what we think about is, the governments would deal with that. Globally, the private sector creates about $30 trillion. The governments, UN, NGOs, $3 trillion. But all these issues are left to the governments to deal with when they don't benefit from the profit. And that's the key question. That's the big issue. 14 billion devices. We're only talking about mobile devices. We're not talking about cyber risk. We're not talking about e-waste. And we're not talking about where the responsibility lies, because the assumption is it's with government. So it's really important to have those conversations. When I read that, it was wonderful to read the Charter. And when I read the Charter and I read, the reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of human person, when I read the word justice and social progress, scourge of war, I think about all of those terms in a cyber sense, right? Because we've moved from the physical world to the cyber world, but we still deal from a crime, from a security, from protection, from laws. We still think about them in a physical sense. And that doesn't necessarily work. Laws in a physical world do not stop money laundering in a dark web, because nobody frankly cares what laws we have. And the government's ability to find who is doing it, for the court's ability to bring those to justice is non-existent. That's how difficult it is. So, and 74 years ago, technology wasn't, no one was thinking about technology, right? And today the world has tremendously changed. So when we think about peace and security in a cyber world, it's something very different. We see cyber intrusions every day to member states. The industrial systems, which are 40 years old, which got this old technology, have been all connected to the internet. And because they're connected to the internet, they are extremely vulnerable. The utility system, water system, transportation system, military, financial system, they're all very vulnerable to cyber attacks. And cyber attacks are happening every day. And it's not necessarily governments. These are actors that are unknown. You can never find out who they are. Now, how do we ensure peace and security in this world? How do we do that? Because, it to me goes back to causality, and we talked a little bit. We as technologists, we as innovators have this great sophistication about technology and innovation, but we have a much lesser sophistication to understand the impact, social impact, financial impact, organizational impact, political impact, not 5 years from now, but 20 years from now, 50 years from now. And it is not getting better. It is getting worse, because that dialogue is not taking place. Technology is just innovating. I think this is the innovation is you can't kind of curtail innovation, right? You choke its vitality. Innovation is happening, and innovation is happening in a very kind of horizontal level. And we can't think about sitting in this room and coming up with laws, because they won't work. You can't implement them. And the question for us is, how do we innovate responsibly? How do we make sure that when we innovate something 40 years from now, we don't see its negative impact? Because it's not like the hiss of Titanic. It takes time. It takes a long time for its impact. If you think about the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, we had a Cold War, we had antibiotics, we sent a man to the moon. The biggest innovation was the internet, really. We got connected. And it brought great prosperity to so many. We talked about wealth distribution, right? Actually, wealth has shifted, which poses its own new questions with AI and projected mass unemployment. I mean, we already have 50% of youth unemployment. right? And if you begin to think about the impact of technology on employment, that number could escalate. And we know what happens with radicalization of youth. And these are the issues as you think about technology and innovation and AI, these are the questions that UN thinks about. How do we deal with unemployment? How do we deal with unrest? Would there be enough jobs? So when you think about the internet and its impact, we could have never envisioned that peace and security will completely change. Crime would change. Today, the largest criminal enterprise is really drug trafficking, right? $4 trillion shifted to the dark web and through cryptocurrency. So the government's ability to track that is minimum. If you think about human trafficking, which is 80% women, 50% children, it's about, I think, 46 million modern-day slaves. Most of commerce happens through the dark web. How do we influence that? And as we sit here as governments and NGOs and UN, we think about how do we do that, the private sector's position is, it's not my problem. It's your problem, and the governments are crippled. So how do we as humanity think about those issues which are exploding and begin to come up with ways to address them? Because technology is amoral, and the fact is that the rules and regulations and governance we had is not embedded in logic. And as David Hume said, good and bad are perceptions of our mind, right? And he talked about causality, cause and effect. And we don't really know what good and bad is. Good and bad to you is something very different to me. And good and bad today is very different 10 years from now. So how do we ensure that we can uphold human dignity, human respect, trust? When you think about identity theft, I think less than 1% of the criminals being caught. When you think about human trafficking, I think only 10 countries have had 1 or 2 cases on human trafficking because it's become so difficult. When you think about the impact on deep fake content, that's just not true. And you're right as a human being, as a citizen, to true content versus fake content. How do we address those issues? Social media and terrorism, we saw a lot of it with ISIS and ISIL, right? Their ability to radicalize youth. Whose responsibility is it to address those issues? Because you can't really regulate the internet. Those people who think we can have policies and regulate, it will never happen. But how do we as a society begin to have space that upholds those basic human issues that are raised here? How do we do that? And I guess what I'm thinking about is not only the UN. The UN of today, with the impact of technology, is very different than the UN of 74 years ago. We have to build, and Sustainable Development Goals, lots of wonderful goals, 17 goals. The most critical goal was number 17, which talks about partnership. And it's through that partnership, it's through having you in this room, it's through having the private sector, it's through having the member states in this room to talk about these issues, because we collectively own them, and the private sector owns a big chunk of them, because that's the only way we can begin to have responsible innovation. It's the only way that we can predict better, because it's really difficult to predict. You think about the impact of single combustion engine and the impact on the environment today. No one could have envisioned the changes the society would see with suburbia, changes in land, water, disease, environment from a single innovation of a single combustion engine. So, and our ability is limited. I mean, as humans, we judge the future based on what we know today. And that judgment is flawed because technology is changing so much. It is this exponential growth. And as Fabrizio said, it'd probably be the slowest time of our history. But our governance, our rules, our policies, they don't move as fast. So there is this gap. And I think that's why we're seeing this huge growth in criminal activity, which we just governments and the sectors cannot deal with. Within the UN, we're deploying certain initiatives to address some of that. We're deploying what we call App Store for Social Good, because we've seen so many apps for which private sector benefits the private sector, but we think we need to use technology for social good. So we're deploying that. We encourage everyone to participate, where we develop solutions to address big issues around SDGs. We're deploying innovation labs, these labs are designed to bring academia, private sector, government, and UN together to innovate in addressing social issues. Again, it's around technology. We're deploying a program we call Digital Blue Helmets. These are our cyber experts who support the UN and support our substantive side of our operation to build cyber expertise. Departments such as UN ODC, which deals with drugs and crime, departments like UN Disarmament, Peace and Security, their roles change tremendously due to cybercrime. We support them. We have a program called Unite Ideas, where we put initiatives up for challenge. We invite you to come. These are initiatives that we're doing on the substantive side, and we need support. And of course, analytics and AI. These are a big part of what we are investing in. Technology, as it aggravates, it also medicates. It's like the Clean Air Act, right? You had the London fog in 1950-51, and then you had the Clean Air Act. So we think positively, although, as I say, our understanding is pessimistic, our willingness is optimistic. So we think positively that we can overcome and we can use technology for the good of humanity, but we can only do it together. I'd just like to close with just a couple of few points. That science and technology is overflowing the boundaries of our existing regulatory framework. It has. And our reliance on that is not effective. So we need new models where we can operate. I think moral accountability of our actions, of our innovation, is critical, and that's something that I always share with my colleagues in the private sector, to think about that. The unpredictability of innovation is there. We just cannot predict the future, but we have to plan for it anyway. We have a paradox in the tech world. We always think about hardware, software, tools. The fact is that it's about its impact on the society, on a culture, and on our way of life. And I think we need to remember what Francis Bacon said. He said that the aim of science was man's ultimate goal to overcome the power that he had lost at the fall. His pursuit for salvation. And if that's our aim as human beings, we have to be very conscious about responsibility and responsible innovation together, and be able to create a world which will address a lot of the social issues and plan for things that we could impact the way of life, including the environment, and all the issues that was raised in the charter here. So thank you so much again for being here. We love having you here at the UN.
Thank you, Arif. And you mentioned drugs, and today actually is World Drug Day, and I know from having worked in the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, so this is a day also for us to remember the victims of the drug trade that is now using the dark web to, what do you call it, wash their money and then use it in other forms. You also spoke about war and cyber war. I think we know what a war looks like. We saw from the images of the Second World War, we see conflicts in different parts of the world today. There was the Cold War, But there is now what people call the cool war. Cool war is happening as we speak. Cyber attacks from one country against another, cyber attacks by non-state actors. It is called cool war. It is happening, and the danger is, what is the threshold that a country will say, that's gone too far, I'm going to retaliate with real war, weapons of real war. So these are all questions that I think are being discussed in this House, and I think this goes back to what I quoted before, it's the power of principles transcending changing perception of expediency, of political expediency, that can ground us in a future that is more principled. So let me now give the floor to our last panel speaker, Dr. Ajit Narayan Mathur, Professor of Strategy in International Business, concurrently affiliated to Economics and Business Policy areas, Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real privilege, honor, and delight to be here on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Charter Day. Much has been said about the concerns that arise from the way technology evolves and the way technology would be used. And I'm reminded of Norbert Wiener, who was the person who coined the term cybernetics. He had already cautioned way back when he was working at the frontiers of cybernetics that the critical issue would be human uses of human beings and how we are going to engage with those human uses of human beings. Walking into this room, I was handed a book which on the cover says, "Words Matter." And it made me think that actually more than words, what matters is the pictures of relatedness that we hold. Because it's these pictures of relatedness that we hold that are the driving force unconsciously of how we conduct our journeys. Because human lives are largely journeys which are propelled by forces which we are not aware of. And only hesitantly and cautiously we occasionally nudge them at the points of forks and intersections when we encounter rational intent. So it's quite important for us to pay attention to what we don't know or what we are not aware of. And I was struck by the chair's attention to the stories around campfires, because one of the reasons why campfires are important are that legends and myths and stories and sharings enable us to express the desire to connect to a larger body than our own, the desire to belong to a community larger than our own. And I believe these are the very values and principles behind the creation of the United Nations. I'm not so convinced that technology will change human nature. There are infinite changeless realities of human nature that have arisen over time, and beneath the surface of constant change, evolution, and transformations, it is that human nature that is quite important to pay attention to, because the pictures of relatedness that we hold today and the pictures of relatedness that we hold in 2045, are they going to be very different? Where are we now? We have the possibility to look at the UN Charter in one of two ways. We could look at it as a document that embodies hope over despair from a salvationist perspective about the world as it can be or the world as it should be. But an alternative would be to look at the UN Charter as an invitation to a dialogic inquiry into the politics of revelation. And an intergovernmental body is bound to have enormous amount of politics of revelation involved in its processes. So if we are able to engage in that dialogic inquiry into revealing the world as it actually is, it's possible that we might be able to then recognize patterns and processes and facilitate transformations so that the normative that we are preoccupied with can also be supplemented by the existential, the phenomenal, and the hermeneutic. And then the Charter can remain relevant for a long, long time. many things have been read into the Charter that are not there in print. For example, peacekeeping itself was a discovery along the way. And it was created by the initiative of the Secretary General of the UN when there was no such provision in the Charter. But he was able to read into Articles 5, 6, 7 the possibilities of interpreting. So I'd also like to highlight that institutions and systems are not systems of computation. So I couldn't be bothered how many digital devices exist in the world. It doesn't matter. What matters is what those systems of interpretation create as meaning-making processes, because the systems of computation can only generate information. It is systems of interpretation that will generate meaning. And in order to get to meaning, we need to really look at where we are now. We have reached the point where Rudyard Kipling's story about as easy as ABC, the drones that will control the world, has almost come true. We are already in the era of driverless vehicles being navigated by GPS systems, mutating microorganisms that can be introduced to create biological warfare anywhere on the planet with great ease. Water scarcity, which is a reality in many parts of the world. There is also complexity driven by techno-commercial considerations. So when David was referring to the power of technology, I was wondering if we should look at it as a triangle. One side is society, one side is the economics, and one side is technology. Or rather, the corners are society, economics, and technology. Then along the lines that connect the dots of the triangle, you would get a techno-economic side. And this techno-economic side, the techno-commercial side, is now about multi-sided markets. It's being driven very largely by what we call the FANG economy. And the FANG economy is the Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. And these large organizations are then controlling or regulating the rest of society, and whether one could actually bring them into the discussion as civil society, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. Because those who are already in the modality of winner takes it all, then the question of involving them would seem like a great concession to those who they believe have become losers and lost it all. But we do need to pay attention to the socio-technical side of the triangle. The socio-technical side of the triangle has always demonstrated that technology has never outright won anything. It's always been a combination of the viable, sustainable socio-technical system. Right from the industrial age, when we had the long wall method of coal mining, which failed. It was definitely the most efficient method, but it failed. Similarly, in the textile industry, the two conventional industries that marked the industrial era, the four-loom to the weaver, that also failed. So what actually came as insights, and that's how the socio-technical systems theory was born when we realized that technology is not everything. There's also the socio-economic side of it. The complexity, of course, has outgrown the pace of our capacity to govern, our capacity to regulate, our capacity to manage system structures and processes. And this has already been flagged by panelist Atif Riazi just before me. What is also important is that we are not able to recognize where we have come from. In the international system, we have an international institution called the ILO, which is the only tripartite body. It was created by the Treaty of Versailles, and it was actually a response to the Bolshevik Revolution. And that part was never remembered until after the Cold War got over, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and then people in the ILO woke up and said, why do we exist? What is our reason for being here? Yes, we have a charter, we have all that, but we don't have a purpose anymore. Because the purpose, if it had been only about the response to the Bolshevik Revolution, that purpose was already over. The identity crisis that institutions can face is important. Today's identity crisis is about loss of civil society. It's about loss of countervailing power. It's also about the incapacity to be able to work with consumers, to be able to work with natural persons, promoting their rights over artificial juridical persons. The balance has completely tilted in favor of artificial juridical persons. We also have zillions of working non-employees on the planet, what we may call the precariat. They are workers, but they are not employees. So the crisis of jobs has almost reached humanitarian emergency proportions. And I believe that one of the actions that the UN should consider is, like we created the International Red Cross, the committee was created long back, we probably need a body like that called the International Blue Cross. Now, 1 year after the internet, in 1994, the UN system had conducted a series of studies on the future of work. And one of the papers I had contributed to that work was a proposal to create an international Blue Cross, because one could see already then that full employment equilibrium will never be achieved. Full employment had already become an impossibility in 1994. But we have neglected that, because nobody is prepared to admit that full employment will never happen again. All our economics has been based on the modeling of full employment equilibriums, but we are not in equilibrium. No economist anywhere on the planet can anymore predict economic growth any more than any financial expert can predict the business cycles. Nobody can say definitely that there won't be a financial crisis in 2020. And nobody can say that there will be. So when we are not able to even see at this distance in time, imagine trying to make sense of what will happen in 2045. Because what's really happened is that the cyclical nature of cycles has ceased to have any significance. We don't have any cycles that we can claim with definite purpose. Structural adjustments, which was the hallmark of World Bank and IMF-led stabilization methods, have also failed. In fact, they've failed more often than they've succeeded. Because the nature of the economies and the nature of societies is no longer governed by structural maladjustments. It's about systemic failures. And these systemic failures are about technologies that are associated with increasing returns to scale and our obsession with measurements. Because while our obsession with measuring things has increased, our capacity to understand that there are unmeasurable phenomena that also affect unmeasurable things has decreased. And I think we really need to look at what not knowing might bring. Because not knowing can generate two responses. It can generate anxiety, and if it generates only anxiety, it'll lead to a clutter of data collection. It'll lead to some false knowing being created, and people being led to action on the basis of that false knowing. Imagine if a doctor found something wrong with a patient and said, fine, I've found what is wrong, and now I can treat the patient. The doctor would not fail to discover what else could be wrong with the patient. The patient can have as many diseases as the patient is capable of having. It's not enough to spot only those singularities and say that we know that we can now interpret and work with that. So I'm saying that the nature of risks has changed. Cyclical risks, which were a function of time, no longer exist. Structural risks, which had to do with partitioning of tasks. This is one of the black holes of management. There is no theory in management which would tell you how to partition tasks in any system. And this is one of the mysteries that we still work with. Systemic risks are about toxicities that arise in institutions and organizations. We are just beginning to have an understanding of how toxicities accumulate. And these toxicities accumulate because they accumulate over claims, grievances, disputes, differences, conflicts, which are left unresolved as agendas, which then produce what I call process risks of willful blindness and neglect of the psychodynamic properties in the collective unconscious. One of my colleagues on the panel spoke about the brain. I don't want to draw him into a discussion on the mind and the brain here, but I would like to point out at least one important difference between the way I would look at the phenomena and the way he looks at it, which is that when we look at the phenomena from the perspective of psychoanalysis, then we are not so concerned about the individual because if we are looking at collective phenomena, we can also notice that people like Wilfred Bion and others have discovered that there are collective defenses that can be unconsciously erected and which can come in the way of rational intent and solving problems with actions. Three of the defenses that Bion had identified, one was about dependency. And religion is one of them that has always produced a lot of dependency problems to be solved through that. The army, on the other hand, represented the fight-flight dimension, and pairing represented the elites or the aristocracies. Even in this day and age, when we look at 75 years of the UN, is 75 years too short a period to say that we don't know or we can't diagnose problems? And if it is, then what is needed to diagnose those problems so that we don't have intractable problems that have no expiry date and have become so wicked problems that they keep getting discussed in perpetuity? There are lots of international issues that have been hanging for at least 25 years without any solution. And I can speak of several of them. One of them is the committee that's working on traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and cultural expressions. Hasn't produced its final output. Similarly, the trade talks that they were launched in Doha, they're still not concluded. So globalization is itself a question mark at the moment because foreign direct investment in the last 6 years has not been increasing. It's stagnant. It's even going down in many parts of the world. So what we are dealing with is the kind of issue that comes from the obsession that we have with the disconnect from the passions that may really be driving us. For example, if there was a reference made to ethics and moral judgments, if psychically impoverished and morally blinded populations begin projecting the capacity for moral judgment to their leaders, would peace and liberal democracy stand a chance at all? So I think we really need to worry about the conditions under which identifying with groups or communities or sects, when people would be ready and become willing for dissolving the walls between themselves and other collectivities. Because the kind of issues that are lying and lurking as invisible, how do we make these issues visible? How do we articulate what has not been articulated? How do we own the disowned? Because there's a lot of disowning going on. How do we enact the withheld? And where do we belong? I'm sometimes surprised that on occasions like this, we forget that we belong to the planet. I'm glad that the speaker, David, spoke about the dot of Carl Sagan. The question also is that if we belong, then how come we still carry a sense of I and the other? And this is something that arises in the process of growing up, because we cannot develop a sense of identity without developing a sense of the other. This is one of those truths which is self-evident and which perpetuates what one may call the reinforcement to hatred. Because hatred is painful. Hatred is rather difficult to tolerate or integrate and manage even in ourselves. And so we need prejudices. And there's this need for prejudices to maintain an enemy into whom we can project our hatred. So we actually hate our neighbors as we hate ourselves. And this edict about loving your neighbor as you love yourself, I think we also ought to reflect on why we hate our neighbors as we hate ourselves, because we disown the hatred inside of us and we project it to figures that are outside of us. The difficult part here is that when a system is very far from equilibrium, and the world system in many ways is very, very far from equilibrium, there will always be discontinuous change with new structures of greater complexity arising. And to work with those discontinuous changes with complexity that is constantly challenging us, we would need the capacity to proactively work with such changes with some kind of safety in containment. And it's only a body like the UN that can provide that safety and containment as an international organization to be able to work with these issues. The kind of polarities that we experience and the kind of dimensions on which it occurs is itself something to worry about, because if we can make the trickles to come alive, we might be able to start new streams of connections. So the digital part of the technology can be very useful here. So I'll conclude by saying that if you believe that small streams can connect, then please start small streams, join with others, let others join you, and let the whole thing expand. But if our belief is that only the paranoid survive, then everyone may die prematurely. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajit. Fabrizio had to leave us. He excused himself, and I think it was really great that he would stay with us for 2.5 hours. I'm amazed you're staying here. The weather outside is great. It's not scorching hot like in Europe, but we're happy about that too. You spoke about, as an economist, you spoke about, of course, economy and the benefit that what businesses do, but you also mentioned the planet, and I like that. Because we often, in our calculations and our aspirations to improve the good of humans, we forget the planet. And that's what we have done for since the Industrial Revolution. And that's why we have the climate change epidemic. This room that we're in is the Economic and Social Council. As if you look up, for those of you new to the building, you will see that this part of the ceiling is nice and complete. The other side is left incomplete. And that wasn't because they ran out of money in 1949 or 1950 when they built the room. It was left uncompleted because this is the work of Economic and Social Council, that the work of this organization, the work that we need to continue to do to improve our economic and social well-being is a never-ending task, unlike the Trusteeship Council, which has a complete ceiling and it completed its task. The Security Council hopefully one day will also complete its task. But the planet and the reference to the planet is something that I wanted to go back to. We had Steven Pinker here as the first inaugural speaker of the President of General ECOSOC speech, and he spoke about his book, Enlightenment Now, and how we live in the best age in the history of humanity in terms of how long we can live, the economic indicators, etc., etc. And I think we also hosted him in the bookshop, and my question to him in the bookshop was that we've done very well for humans, but if we were sitting here representing other species, it would be a completely different discussion. We have led a world into the extinction of thousands of species, and there are reports that by the end of this century, more than existing half of the species that we know today will be extinct. So we need to think more than just our own and innovation for our own good. And innovation can also go both ways. Like a knife, we can chop an onion in a knife, and also we can stab somebody. And the same thing that goes for the knife can go for the digital world in which we now inhabit. So let me now turn to, I know we have a group of young students with us who would like to, a new generation who are more familiar with technology than we are. We'll turn to them to give one sentence each, and I hope that they will stick to the one sentence so that we can have I know we are half an hour behind the schedule, so they can give you some room. To release these voices of youth, I call on Sam Vagar, Executive Director and co-founder of the Millennium Campus Network, to say something, and then we will move to the students. Sam?
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Excellent. So I'll try and be very brief. And Maher, I do want to thank you. You asked us to read the preamble together. And on Charter Day, to do that, I just there was one part that stood out to me, which was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. And I would ask all of us today, do our politics, do our discourse actually uphold that vision and values? To reaffirm fundamental human rights in the dignity and worth of the human person. That charter is our North Star. It has given us a very clear mandate for where we as humanity must go. And I'm here very briefly to offer a millennial perspective on what we have seen and really not just in words but in actions, what is already taking place. How many of you, by a show of hands if you're able, are students or work with students? Okay. So for all of you, number one, thank you. Number two, the reality is, the majority of the students who will be around in 2045 probably aren't even born yet. And so it is so important to have an intergenerational dialogue on where we take this work next. And so I just wanted to offer a very specific look at what Millennium Fellows are doing around the world, because we've built a movement. It started when I was 19 years old coming into these spaces, but not just being inspired by the spaces, but the people. And so when I was 19, we started in our college dorm rooms the Millennium Campus Network, MCN, to help undergraduates take action on the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've helped more than 6,000 young people have concrete impact on these goals. 75% of our alumni are now in social impact careers, making a difference. And last year, we launched the partnership with the United Nations Academic Impact. And we launched it in presenting the Millennium Fellowship. So it's a leadership development program, and for all of you who are students or work with students, it's a platform to provide training, connections, credentials to undergraduates making a difference on the SDGs, on UN goals. And really, David, something you spoke about is that need for empathy. And so our core values, what we focus on instilling in these young leaders, is a commitment to empathy, humility, inclusion as guiding values in this work. And if we can layer on top of that a focus on technology for social impact, that is incredibly powerful. And so we had 402 Millennium Fellows graduate the program last year. Young people at Alma College in Central Michigan tackling food insecurity through aquaponics farming. Young women at Afat University in Saudi Arabia who noted that the field of cybersecurity is only 20% female, and so created a digital mentorship program to support young women going into the field. And if I could spotlight just 3 Millennium Fellows who stood out to us, who are leveraging technology to realize the SDGs. An issue very close to my heart, and I'm sure many of you, when I was in middle school, I remember viscerally being bullied. I remember that experience, the words that were said, the derogatory language that was used. Well, today we're not just facing physical bullying, we're facing cyberbullying. It's an epidemic. And so Carissa Shaw, a young woman who's studying at the University of Pennsylvania, created an organization, Cyber Sensibility. Cyber Sensibility has created an experiential curriculum to help middle schoolers who are tackling cyberbullying. It's now being used by 1,200 middle schoolers across the United States. And with the power of this network, with the Millennium Fellowship, it's actually been adapted and localized in India and Nigeria. And so to just close with 2 other examples, one in India, her colleagues who are localizing this curriculum also have their own initiatives. Nadeem Mohammed Shahjahan, along with colleagues Sarath Shaji, has created Aggravator. And Aggravator in India is focused on SDG 13. So it's working on countering 2 major threats agriculture faces today: the lack of rainfall and depleted underground water. And it's a project that uses advanced automated irrigation system to find the amount of water required for the plant using different parameters and execute it. This one project uses AI to predict the adequate amount of water supply that would be required to support optimal growth. That's a project that's benefiting 150 people today. And the last project I wanted to highlight, Philemon Kuza with the Open Campus Initiative at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. He identified a simple problem. Students are producing research papers in Nigeria and around the world. But a lot of times, those research papers, all that knowledge, ends up sitting on a shelf. So what if you could create a digital platform so that students could access each other's research and draw upon it? What if you could build that community of practice? He's doing that at his university. 121 students are now involved in that project, have uploaded their research, and he wants to expand it across Nigeria. Those are just 3 of 402 Millennium Fellows who graduated the program last year. And we often overlook students. We write them off. We say it's just one little small project. It doesn't really matter. Well, those 402 young people, those 402 Millennium Fellows, volunteered nearly 50,000 hours last year on 214 unique projects, positively impacting the lives of 393,449 people in 13 countries. All grassroots, local solutions, local response to the challenges they saw. This year, thanks to the United Nations Academic Impact, we've had over 7,000 applications from 850 campuses in 135 countries. That is a movement. That is what young people are doing. We don't have to sit around and ask ourselves, are young people stepping up to actually affirm the vision and values of the Charter? They're doing that work. We all know that. That's why we're here. And so I would just say, as a millennial, we have to tap into both our intellectual imagination, but marry it with our moral imagination, really for restorative acts for humanity to make that charter real. And so what we're building with the Millennium Fellowship in proud partnership with the United Nations Academic Impact is a global community of practice to tackle, to take action, accelerate action, to make the SDGs reality. We'd be honored to collaborate with each and every one of you, and really honored to be with you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sam. And I think it's really great to hear all of these positive stories and incredible contributions. Just going back to something David said, that the United Nations should reinvigorate the visceral experience of hope. Hope is something that actually motivates, and I know that fear and anger can get viral on the internet, but our job is to make hope and hope for a better future do the same. So let me now turn, we're lucky to have with us students from around the world who are in the United States for the annual Global Solutions Laboratory organized by Global Education Motivators, GEM, and their interpret leaders, Medard Gable and Wayne Jacoby. Thank you for being with us. So we've asked the students to share with us, ideally in a single sentence, the technological or scientific breakthrough that they visualize or hope for to help the United Nations in fulfilling its mission in the year 2045. So let's first invite Gurinder Singh. Gurinder? Yep. Your sentence.
So technology for now needs to, as we see, the main problem for today's world is climate change. So I aspire technologies to develop in this field and deal with this main issue that is being developed right now.
Thank you, Gurinder. Now I invite Fustin Sipishimbu.
Thank you. I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in Congo we have a lot of issues with clean water and electricity. So I hope that the technology in 2045 will bring the clean water to all the population around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Fustin. I now invite Ati Chang.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah, thank you. Addressing the need of youth empowerment in order to make them current and future global citizens that can actually contribute with good ideas, good decisions, good action on the ground. I think there is a need to develop or use existing applications and social networks on which youths are really engaged in order to teach them or raise their awareness on global issues on which the UN is working, such as peace, climate change, poverty, and education. Thank you.
Thank you, and I invite you to look at the agenda, Youth 2030, the agenda for the UN strategy for youth that was launched from this room in September of last year. I hope it will have elements that you were looking for. Thank you, Ati. Now I invite Fawaz Ali Khan.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So I think climate change is like one of the most dire topics in the world right now, and not many people know about that. So it would be better by the help of technology, we can spread awareness in the world about climate change and help people prevent the inevitable doom.
Thank you. Thank you, Fawaz. It is one of the top priorities for the Secretary General, and he is hosting a Climate Action Summit on the 23rd of September, and everybody is invited to mobilize around the world around that day and before to focus attention on climate change. It is definitely an existential threat, we agree. Invite now Zogori Moni Audrey Lade. I'm sorry for slaughtering your name.
My interest here is about human trafficking, because I hope that the technology, the new technology, can locate all the victims about human trafficking in the worldwide.
Thank you. That is very, very valid, and I think you picked up on what Atifa spoke about. Now I invite Mariam Samashvili.
I really hope for the digital platform which will allow women who survived human trafficking to exchange their information and awareness on human trafficking and to help to empower each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much for echoing the same, and I think incredible priority indeed. Now I invite Alexander Grosse.
So, as my two colleagues outlined, that climate change is an absolutely dire need that needs to be resolved, and we had worked together this week to come up with a potential solution for that. My proposal is using and furthering the technology of carbon collection membranes. These work to filter out pollutants coming out of factories and cost only about just below $100 per ton of carbon collected. Thank you.
Thank you. Carbon harvest is indeed something we need to do. Thank you, Alexander. Now I invite Jawariya Ali Khan.
First of all, I'm very thankful to be here. I think what I would envision by 2045 and what I think is a very top priority and I hope is there by then is accessible and available quality education for everybody. I think that is key to anything we want to do, any step we want to further. Education and awareness is what empowers women, men, children to do something and accomplish something. Specifically, the way the world is going, I think with an emphasis on mental health would be very, very key to the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, and I like that you didn't say education, you said quality education, because there's a difference between any education and quality education. And still, there are 60 million children who do not attend school today. Thank you very much for that. So all of you have now enriched our program with your voices, and I think it's maybe we've done a good job on climate change. Most of you mentioned climate change, and I think the others are impactful as well. And I think this is something that we really believe in is needed to mobilize not just governments, private sector, academic institutions, everybody is indeed to. I'm looking at the time. We have about less than 15 minutes, but I would like still to open the floor for any comments, discussion from the floor. If you have any burning question that you'd like to address to the panel members.
Yes, please.
Yes, can I see hands? Well, okay. 1 and 2, we'll take you, and then press the button when it's red. You can speak and identify yourself, please, and try to be brief. Thanks.
Hi, can everyone hear me? My name is Jacqueline Tran, and I'm an anthropologist. I've been long very interested in sort of the cultural phenomenon that both inform and also surround technology. While I do think it's very fascinating and wonderful that you have all these efforts by your sort of Millennial Network campus group to kind of mobilize young people to take initiative, From personal experience, I've also seen that within the internet age, you also have an oversaturation of information, which has caused a sort of contemporary complacency amongst young people, have driven them to sort of lose faith in governments and formal institutions. Fabrizio mentioned that restructuring governance systems for the digital age is necessary because we still live in, I guess, still operate in ones in which we still are kind of working within the nuclear age. And so I guess my question is, or more of like my question is if you could speak to the sorts of ways in which anybody on the panel, you could speak to the ways in which we can mobilize young people to sort of go beyond that contemporary complacency, not just by having, I guess, literacy, like digital literacy, but to actually create enthusiasm to involve critical thinking skills, to be involved in policy, to actually make that difference, and not just kind of look at our screens, see that there was another, something that had happened around the world, and not really do anything about it. If you could have any thoughts about that, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's gather all the questions in one go, and then we can have, please, yes. Yes.
So my name is Professor Dr. Cowan. I am from Touro College, and I would like to ask the question to the whole panel in regards to surveillance capitalism. I just wrote a paper on biometric privacy concerns in virtual and augmented reality spaces in regards to tier 1 companies. Do you have any thoughts about surveillance capitalism and how dangerous you find that particular phenomena for the collective futures of students who might be using in-world spaces?
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am Bircan Ünver and I represent the Late Millennium Organization. I have, yes, two burning questions. One is in reference to internet control or global protocol of internet, because Ms. Perez has mentioned that it's impossible. I wonder that especially UNGA and Security Council hand in hand can come up with a global protocol for internet for preventing dark business, drug trafficking, human trafficking, all that it's been mentioned. That's the one burning question, or an idea if that could be worked towards too, that UN could come up with a global constitution for internet. The second is 50% of the youth is today and next 10, 20 years more be unemployment. But the more disappointing parts of that, even though today when we talk about good quality education, master degrees students in the world, in the US, they can get the job, they really work hard, pay hard, and have to pay that maybe next 20 years. We are wasting the human resources. What are the solutions? Especially we are here talking about celebrating the UN Charter and academic impact, and there is a really serious issue which doesn't come up table enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, please, one last question.
Yes, thank you. The time is already here when AI will overpower human capability. Think about the Boeing 737 MAX. To what extent can the UN lead a movement so that humans will always be able to override technology in the interest of safety?
Thank you. We got caught up with the time, so I just want to maybe ask David to give us some remarks, concluding remarks from all of what you've heard, and address any of the questions that were asked, and I will address some of the ones maybe asked to the UN.
Sure. So the first question about the lack of civic engagement, I think that is increasingly a challenge for open societies, and part of it is why would anyone be motivated to civic engagement in the first place? And I think, again, if we recall the history of how the UN came to be, it was because people saw how bad things could get. And so I'm a big believer that sometimes past successes can set yourselves up for future failures. And so in some respects, a lot of open societies have achieved a high standard of living. Things are fairly good. And so you have a generation that is not necessarily aware of how bad things could be. And so part of it is maybe, one, recognizing that by and large, those that are even able to ask that question are already fairly privileged, and maybe they need to have a responsibility to give back. But then two, recognize that there may be forces at work, internal or external, that are trying to demotivate you to do anything. And it's not to take the view that you should take a stand and only believe that your way is the right way for civic engagement. It is getting to the idea of empathy. What I really would like are bridge builders, because I think, especially in open societies right now, technology is fragmenting us. It's making us more lonely. It's making us think somehow we're more connected because we somehow have 3,000 friends on some platform. But at the same time, we've actually lost those actual bridges. And so I would recommend, how do you motivate people to get engaged? Find something you care about. Find something you think is needing to be fixed. But then, in addition to being passionate about that, also adopt what President Lincoln said in the United States, which is, I do not like that man or woman. I must get to know them better. Make sure you understand the other side of whatever the challenges are as well. But I also recognize that that's an open society question. Some societies don't have that. I'm going to now jump to the surveillance capitalism question and what might be happening in AI, AR. So there are three doors in which this technological future may unfold itself. It was kind of implicit that I was suggesting that the world is increasingly getting instrumented with network devices. We could have easily talked about that the next 5 or so years, the amount of low Earth orbit satellites that are going to be launched are going to double. And so these stats do matter because they are instrumenting the planet at unprecedented levels. Now, there's huge possibilities for that because we can monitor what's happening to the climate. We can create greater awareness, but it also presents three possible doors. One is the door of surveillance state, that basically everything you do is always being watched. And in some respects, there are some countries that may make the choice that they're okay with that because that gets to safety, that they feel more safe living in that environment. There's also the case of surveillance capitalism, which is the free market making value off that data. There are going to be some people that are willing to download that free app or download that free thing in exchange for that service. My concern is that's not a conscious choice or an informed choice. So that gets to door number 3, which is the planet's going to get instrumented. Short of a major catastrophe, the planet is getting instrumented with technological devices. But what we need to do is give people, I come from public health, choice and information so they can be more aware of when they make those choices. And again, those choices aren't accept all or nothing. It's a resistat as to, I'm willing to share this data in exchange for that, or I'm not willing to, but I'm willing to pay for the service. And the only way you can actually address that is provide compelling alternatives. You can't just say X is bad or that platform is bad if there's nothing else that takes its place. And so if you're interested, People's Internet, we are actually investing in different possibilities to actually show alternative models. But it doesn't have to just be us. It can be anyone in the world. Show a different way forward for door number 3. The question about internet security. So I work for Vint Cerf, who was one of the people that actually helped create TCP/IP, the Internet Protocol. He would say TCP/IP was never meant to be a final standard. It was actually meant to be updated on a regular basis, and unfortunately we have not. That said, just like in the real world, we do our best to have security around this building, but nothing's going to guarantee that nothing wrong is ever going to happen. The same is true with the internet. And so I think there needs to be discussions about, in the real world and in the physical world, if you want something to be open, secure, and private, you can probably get 2 of the 3, but you probably can't get all 3. And then how do you balance that? Job creation, I think that is going to become a big thorny issue for the next 10 years around the world, if it's not already. And to me, I think it's recognizing we've been through this before. Agricultural societies, you work 24/7. And it was a major transition when you went from working in agricultural society to industrial societies where you were still working long hours, 12 hours, six days a week. But there was a fundamental shift, and there's some theorists that say that the way we humans dealt with that, unfortunately, was through alcohol and other approaches, is that was the social sedative that helped us bridge that gap. Then when we went from working in some places, from working in factories 6 days a week, 12 hours, to working in more knowledge worker settings, which I recognize is not the case for everybody in the world, there's also some that say we dealt with that through sitcoms. So we humans have been moving inequitably, of course, unfortunately not equitably around the world as a whole. We've been moving to working less and less hours. In some respects, that's good. The bad news is we humans need a sense of purpose. And so what I would say, it's both a question of how do you address the fact that jobs are being destroyed and it's unclear at the rate that new jobs will be created. More jobs may be created eventually, but the question is what's the lag effect? But it's more a question of where do you get your sense of identity and purpose? And so much of what we've tied up right now is your identity and purpose comes from your job. I would submit we need to find alternatives that link your identity and purpose to communities and working in the communities, whether that's a vocation or an avocation. And that's a conversation that I think the United Nations could have. But I won't, I'll leave you to decide whether or not you take it on. Lastly, AI and security. Again, this is where we need to have a conversation about what is that third door that is neither surveillance state nor surveillance capitalism. And again, some places will pick one of those doors because they are willing to be more safe in an era in which everything is being watched. Other places will not pick that. And I don't think we can say one size fits all for the world. But what we can do is at least have conversations and possibly encourage projects that are door number 3 for those that want to take up the mantle of open societies that are still pluralistic, recognizing that the world is being instrumented, but we want you to have decision and choice in that space. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I think before I just give maybe a final comment on some of the questions, our gratitude, of course, to the Boston Global Forum for its support, and in particular to Mr. Nguyen Tuan, co-founder and director of the Michael Dukakis Institute for Leadership and MDI, and co-founder and CEO of Boston BGF, and also to Governor Dukakis himself. I would also like to maybe thank people who haven't been named in passing, maybe Ramu Damodaran, Lanice Collins, Fernando, Jane, and Matthew. Please stand up. Thank you. These are the ones who have worked behind the scene, have put this event together, and I think we owe them a great debt of gratitude. Maybe just to the questions about what the United Nations can do and what the United Nations cannot do. The United Nations is not a world government. The United Nations is a forum for governments to come, and it is based, I mean, the governments are sovereign in their own right. It is based on the collective agreement of these sovereign governments to come together and try to find global solutions to global problems. And in today's world, we see the problems becoming more and more global that no one country can deal with alone. So the importance of this platform is more than any time before. So within different governments, they have regulations that dictate how they work within those. And some of those regulations, in most cases, are informed or related to an international convention that has been reached here. And some of those agreements lead to big successes. We talk about climate change, and I think the Paris Agreement was a major step. But of course, the Paris Agreement put us on the way to a solution, not quite, because we were really decades behind in trying to reach it. The Katowice COP meeting last November or December actually created the roadmap for achieving Paris. And we see a lot of movement on that. Are we there? No. And this is why the Secretary General is holding a Climate Action Summit this year. And that Climate Action Summit, he's inviting leaders of government, leaders of private sector, leaders of financial institutions, leaders of civil society, academic, to come together with solutions. You do not come to that summit to make a speech. The Secretary General does not want to hear speeches. He wants to hear actions, and he wants to hear commitments, and that will get us to the change we do. To give you a positive example to what can be done. For those of you young people here, you will not remember the early 1980s, what was on everybody's mind was the ozone layer. the manufacturing of certain chemicals that we used in industry was eroding the ozone layer, which was growing, and sun rays and ultraviolet light was causing cancers and was seen as a problem that is not easy to do. Then within the framework of the United Nations, the Montreal protocols were concluded and regulations were stipulated that basically prevented certain chemicals from being used. And today we see that the ozone layer is healing. So that was a major problem, and that was a solution that member states and industry came together and found it. So when there is a will, there's a way. And I think this is where, ending on this story of hope, we can work together to achieve things that we can all aspire will improve our collective lives in the future. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I really, truly want to thank all the panel members, excellent contributions. Hope to see you again back at the UN and to continue these discussions on SDGs in academia. Thank you.